अब चलनी चाहिए आई गेस। भाई कान फाड़ रहा है ये बंदा, मेरे को हार्ड सा लग रहा कोर्स भाई। नहीं फटेगी भाई, वेबसाइट तो बन के रहेगी आज। आज ही बनेगी वेबसाइट। बस अब कोई पुश करने वाला नहीं है, तू तो थोड़ा मिल जाता। देखना लौड़े चल रही है कि नहीं। मेरे में तो आ रही है। बस अब कोई पुश करने वाला नहीं है, तू तो थोड़ा मिल जाता। अब आ रही है लौड़े, देखना। सेम स्ट्रीम नहीं, दूसरी। अच्छा अच्छा, उसकी लिंक चेंज हो गई होगी ना, फक भाई। ये तो बीटी हो गई भाई। हाँ तो माँ चुदा है, मैं स्टोरी हटा रहा हूँ, स्टोरी हटा रहा हूँ, माँ चुदा है। भाई तो स्ट्रीम तो करूंगा ही नहीं, स्टोरी हटा दूंगा ना। हाँ भाई, 24 घंटों की कितनी फाइल जीबी हो जाएगी। है। मतलब स्ट्रीम तो कर ही रहा हूँ मैं, लेकिन बस बंद कर देता हूँ ना उधर से, आगे से। इंस्टा से वो स्टोरी हटा दूंगा, वो लिंक काम नहीं कर रही होगी ना अब शायद। अच्छा। हाँ तो अब नई। हाँ तो नई वाली नहीं देख पाएगा ना वो फिर। हाँ वही तो कह रहा हूँ, नई स्टोरी डालनी पड़ेगी ना फिर लौड़े। स्ट्रीम बंद नहीं कर रहा ना, स्ट्रीम कहाँ बंद कर रहा हूँ, स्ट्रीम तो चल ही रही है। स्टोरी डाउन कर रहा हूँ, ऐसे बोल रहा हूँ, लिंक काम नहीं कर रही होगी, अब 1 घंटे की क्या ही देखेंगे लोग। हाँ। क्या ही देखेंगे लोग। हाँ। लौड़ा क्या ही देखेंगे लोग। हाँ। लौड़ा क्या ही देखेंगे लोग। अपन ने हेडलाइन यूज़ करना सीख लिया है। ये सिलेक्ट कर सकता हूँ, एंड उसके बाद अपन ने रिच टेक्स्ट। Cool है.
And it's so powerful because it lets us use high quality animations. And well, Lottie is a file type for animation, and it's so powerful. If you head over to the media section here in the add panel, you can see that there is an element called Lottie. Let's drag and drop this element into my container. Well, Lottie is a file type for animation, and it's so powerful because it lets us use high quality animations, and most importantly, it lets us control different properties of that animation. For example, we can make it interactive, we can make it play in reverse, and other things. We will talk about Lottie animations in detail later.
Using duration, loop, play in reverse.
But for now, let's give it a try. In the assets file, JSON file, which is basically what we need if we want to use a Lottie animation. If I just click on this replace Lottie sequence button, I can simply choose this animation, and there we go. Now we have the animation, but let me preview that. If I click on this preview animation, the animation plays from 0 to 100%. How cool is that? I can check the loop option. Let's preview it. There we go. It plays again and again and again. I can choose the play in reverse option. Just like that. If you want to build a website that has a contact us page or even a newsletter section, for sure you need to use forms. Well, a form can have different elements like label, inputs, text area, checkboxes, radio buttons, form button, etc. If you head over to the forms section on the add panel, you can see that we have different elements here. We have form block that groups different form elements like label, input, form button. We have label, which is just a simple text block. We have input, it's a text field. We have the text area for long sentences and long content. We have checkboxes. We have radio buttons for selections. We have the select element if you want to let the user select from different options. We have reCAPTCHA, and we have the form button. We also have the file upload element here, but it's only available when you add a site plan to your website. All right, when we want to create a form, first we need a form block. As I mentioned before, it gathers together all these form elements, the necessary ones. So I'm going to drag and drop it into my container on the canvas. There we go. As you can see, this form block already has some elements, like 2 labels, 2 text fields, and 1 button. You can see the text layers because of its color. I'm going to go ahead and modify the color and the styling here. Right now it's better. So when you drag and drop a form into your canvas, the form settings pops up. A form block has different properties. It has different states, and it has a form name. So here, let me show you different states of a form block. When we work with forms, we have the normal, success, and error states. So what's the difference between them? The normal state is the one that you are looking at. It's just a normal form. The success state actually shows a message to the user once the form has been submitted successfully. We can easily customize each of these states, and the error state shows an error to the user when something goes wrong. For now, you can't see the text because we already changed the styling of these text layers, but if I select this text block, I can go ahead and modify the color to black. Now you can see it. If you want to design different states of your form, you need to make sure to first select your form block in the navigator, okay? Not the form elements. First select your form block, then you can double click somewhere, or you can just select your form block and click on this settings icon, just like that. Now let's talk about the form name. Well, you might need to use different forms on your website, and it's important to name them properly because later when we receive form submissions, we can easily recognize that which information is associated with which form. So I'm gonna name this form demo, okay? I'm gonna go to normal, and these elements have some styling by default that we can override. We're not gonna talk about styling now, but I'm gonna show you that this is a text field, and a text field has some properties as well. If I select a text field, if I double click on it, you can see that the input settings pops up. Each text field has different settings like name, placeholder, text type, and here we have the required and autofocus options. You can easily name these text fields. For example, if this text field is associated with this name label, you can simply call it name. If it's gonna be surname, you can simply name it surname here. And we have the placeholder as well. So if I want to present a placeholder right on the text field, I can write it here. Let's write enter your surname. Just like that. We have the text type as well. By default, it's set to plain, and it means the text could be anything, okay? We could set it to email, we could set it to password, we can set it to phone or number. Why does it matter? Because here for the email text field, the text type is already set to email. Why? Because when the user tries to fill in these text fields and hit the submit button, then this text field checks whether there is a valid email address for you. For example, if we have something like test at, it will give the user an error, okay? There should be a valid email address. It doesn't check whether that email address exists or not because it's not possible, but it just checks the format of that email address. The same thing happens with password, phone, or number. Now let's talk about these two options. We have the required option. If I check this checkbox, it means that the user has to fill this text field. If I uncheck that, it's an optional text field. If I check the autofocus, it means whenever the page loads up, this text field is autofocused and the cursor is already blinking. I'm going to set it to required, and I'm going to uncheck the autofocus, and then let's select this submit button. If I double click on that, I can simply modify these properties. There are two properties when it comes to form buttons: button text and waiting text. I can set it to anything like send, for instance, and then the waiting text. This text appears when the user clicks on this button and he or she is waiting for the form submission. So here, let me modify that to wait a moment. Not the best waiting text, by the way. All right, now let's give it a try. To try a form, you cannot just go to the preview mode because it doesn't work like that. You need to first publish some submissions. We can easily recognize that which information is associated with which form. So I'm gonna name this form demo. Okay, I'm gonna go to normal, and these elements have some styling by default that we can override. We're not gonna talk about styling now, but I'm gonna show you that this is a text field, and the text field has some properties as well. If I select the text field, if I double click on it, you can see that the input settings pops up. Each text field has different settings like name, placeholder. And we have, for example, if we have something like test at, it will give the user an error, okay? This text field. If I uncheck that, it's an optional text field. If I check simply modify these properties, there are two properties. Text field is autofocus and the cursor is already blinking. I'm gonna set it to required and I'm gonna uncheck the autofocus. And then let's select this submit button. If I double click on that, I can simply modify these properties. There are two properties when it comes to form buttons, button text and waiting text. I can set it to anything like send, for instance. And then the waiting text. This text appears when the user clicks on this button and he or she is waiting for the form submission. So here, let me modify that to wait a moment. Not the best waiting text, by the way. All right, now let's give it a try. To try a form, you cannot just go to the preview mode because it doesn't work like that. You need to first publish your website. We didn't talk about the publish option, but it's so simple. First, I'm going to click on this publish button on the top right corner. We don't need to change anything. Just click on publish to select the domains, okay? Just like that. This is a unique domain created by Webflow for our project. And then once this button turns green, it means that our website is published. And if I click on this button, this little icon right next to this link, I can check my website. So here is our form. Let me go ahead and check the type of this text field because I changed it to number mistakenly. It should be plain since it's just a surname. I'm going to publish my website once again, and I'm going to refresh this page. There we go. Now this is a plain text field. Here, let me write test, and for the email address, I'm going to write test at. Okay, this is not a right email address. This is not a correct format for that email address. If I hit the send button, look what happens. Please enter a part following at. Okay, so this is what happens when you choose the email text field type. And then let's write gmail.com. Now everything should work perfectly. I'm going to hit the send button, wait a moment, and we will get the success message. Of course, the styling is not good because we already changed the color, but you just got the idea. If something is wrong with the internet connection, we will get the error. So let me refresh the page, and I'm just going to disconnect my internet connection for a second. Here, let's write test2, and I'm going to write another email address, hello@gmail.com. If I hit the send button, look what happens. Oops, something went wrong while submitting the form. So this is the difference between different states of a form. Now let's see how we can get access to the form submissions. Well, we need to go to the project settings. As I showed you before, if you head over to this W icon on the top left corner, and if you hover over it, you will see this hamburger menu icon. I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to go to project settings. Right from here, I'm going to go to the forms tab, and here we have different settings of a form. We can specify the form name here. We can send the form submissions to a specific email address. We can write the subject line. We can specify an email address for replies, and also the email template. We will talk about these options later, but for now, you just need to know that if you scroll down here, you can find the form submission data. And as you can see, we submitted one form. It says surname test, email address test@gmail.com. You can simply delete this submission. You can download all the submission data using this download CSV button as a CSV file. And one thing you need to keep in mind is that there is a limit for receiving submissions. If you don't add hosting to your project, you can get up to 50 submissions per month. We will dive into these advanced settings of forms later when we start creating our projects, but this is basically all about forms. Let's go back to the designer. I'm going to hit the designer button. I'm going to select my form block just like that. And let me check out other elements here. So here we have a label, input, text area. We can simply drag and drop any of these elements into our form block, and all these elements have their own properties. So let me go ahead and drag and drop a checkbox here, just like that. It has different properties. We can drag and drop a select element here. If I want to specify the selection options, I can select this select field and go to the element settings. From here, you can see that we have the choices. We have select one, first choice, second choice, third choice. We can simply modify them. But let's preview it, okay? There we go. This is how it looks. The checkbox could be checked and unchecked. The text area. Refresh the page, and I'm just going to hosting to your project out other elements here. So here we have a label, input, text area. We can simply drag and drop any of these elements into our form block, and all these elements have their own properties. So let me go ahead and drag and drop a checkbox here, just like that. It has different properties. We can drag and drop a select element here. If I want to specify the selection options, I can select this select field and go to the element settings. From here, you can see that we have the choices. We have select one, first choice, second choice, third choice. We can simply modify them. So let's preview it, okay? There we go. This is how it looks. The checkbox could be checked and unchecked. The text area could be enlarged, and everything works as expected. Most websites nowadays have a navigation bar at the top. If you take a look at some famous websites, you can see that they use a navigation bar in order to show some menu options to the user. For example, here we have the navigation bar that has some menus like Mac, iPad, iPhone, or here we have the navigation bar that has products, use cases, developers, etc., and also a button. Most navigation bars have some common elements like a logo that is clickable, so this is a link block. They have some menu options, they are also usually link blocks, and they have a button on the right side. So we can create a navigation bar manually using a div block and a link blocks and other elements, but there is a pre-built element in Webflow. So if I scroll down here, under the components, there is the nav bar. If I drag and drop it into my body element here, as you can see, this nav bar has been added to my canvas, and it has some elements in.
एक सेकेंड चार्ज लगा के आया मैं.
Inside there is a container, it's just a div block, we already talked about it, and inside there are some other elements. There is a link block in which we will put our logo, and then we have the nav menus, this is another div block that holds all these links, and finally there is a menu button, but we can't see any menu button here. Just wait a second. A nav bar element is dynamic and responsive, and if we go from the desktop breakpoint to tablet breakpoint, you can see what happens. All those menu links are disappeared, and instead we have this hamburger menu button, and this is associated with this menu button in the navigator, which was not visible in the desktop breakpoint. So the nav bar is already responsive. If I preview this project, this menu button appears, and there is no logo because we didn't add one yet. So this is basically how a nav bar works. We can customize these links. If we double click on any of these links, we can modify the text. We can also select this nav link element, and if I click on this settings icon, I can modify the URL. We can ask this to take the user to a specific page or to a specific section of our website. This is just a link block, okay? Therefore, we have all the properties of a link block. So a nav bar is basically a div block, which is responsive already, and it has some pre-built elements that we can use. If you want to create a custom nav bar, that's totally fine. We can do that simply. But most of the time, we will use the nav bar element because it makes our life much easier since it's already responsive and everything is ready for us. If you want your images or your videos to be displayed in a full screen view on any device, you can use a lightbox. If you head over to the components section on the add panel, you can find a lightbox component. I'm going to drag and drop it into my container. There we go. This is a lightbox link. And in order to work with that, we need a thumbnail. So if I double click on that, I can choose the image inside because by default, it has an image. And from my assets, I can choose this image. And I'm going to decrease the width and height to 300 pixels. And the height is going to be 400 pixels, just like that. All right, so this is a lightbox link. Let's preview and see what happens. If I click on that, nothing happens because in order for a lightbox to work, we need to specify a media for that. We need to go ahead and select our lightbox link, and then we need to head over to the element settings right next to the side panel, and from here we can find lightbox settings, and there is this media section. We can either choose an image or a video. Let's start with an image. I'm going to select an image, the same image from my assets. There we go. There is this caption here. We are not going to add a caption for now because I'm going to show you the difference between these two options. I'm going to save, and then let's preview it. There we go. If I click on my lightbox link, we can preview this image in a full screen view on any device. It works perfectly on mobile, tablet, or any screens, just like that. But what if I want to have multiple lightbox links? Well, that's very simple. I can simply drag and drop more lightboxes, or I can simply copy this lightbox and paste it again and again and again. So let me remove the lightbox link, and I'm going to copy this lightbox link, Command C or Control C, and Command V or Control V once again to get 3 different lightbox links. All right, by default, there is no padding between them. So I'm going to select this lightbox link, the first one, and I'm going to go to the spacing and just add some right padding, like 10 pixels. And as you can see, immediately a class has been created. We didn't talk about classes yet, but for now we just need this name, lightbox link. Later we will dive into classes. I'm going to select the second lightbox, and from here I'm going to look for lightbox link class, just like that. And once I apply this class to the second lightbox link, this element can use all the stylings that I already defined for this particular class. All right, cool. Now I'm going to change the thumbnail of these 2 lightbox links. So let me double click on it and replace the image to this one. And for the third one, I'm going to do the same thing. There we go. Our thumbnails are ready. Now let's preview it. The first one looks fine. The second one shows the same image because we just copied and pasted it. The third one the same. So what we need to do is we need to select our second lightbox link, then head over to the element settings. And from here, we need to remove that media and add another image that corresponds to this thumbnail. Cool. I'm going to save it. For the third one, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to remove this media and choose the proper image and save. Now it should work perfectly. So let's give it a try. I'm going to click on the first image, the second one, and the third one. But here, as you can see, there is no caption. So what happens if I add a caption to our media? Let's go and check it out. I'm going to select the first lightbox link, and from here, I'm going to click on this first image, and let's add a caption. This is a nice image. Cool. Save. Now let's see what happens. If I click on it, as you can see, a caption has been added to the bottom of this image. That's very handy. But what if I want to connect my lightboxes together? So we can do that. That's very simple. First, we need to select this lightbox link, the first one. And under the media, there is a checkbox that says link with other lightboxes. If I check this, here I can specify a group name. It's very important because if you have multiple lightboxes on a page, this is how we can connect them properly. Okay. So let's give it a name. I'm going to write main. Okay. I'm going to copy it. Let me select my second lightbox link, and I'm going to paste that name here. For the third one, I'm going to do the same thing. And now our lightbox links are connected. Let's give it a try. I'm going to click on this first link, and there we go. Now we have this kind of slider interaction. I can click on this right arrow button and I can simply move through these items. That's very useful. For example, if you want to create an e-commerce website and you need to show different images of a particular product, you can use a lightbox. So let's recap. In order to work with lightboxes, first, you need to drag and drop a lightbox link into your canvas. Second, you need to choose your thumbnail, which is this image. And third, which is so important, you need to add a media for that particular lightbox link. If you want to connect your lightbox links, you need to check this link with other lightboxes and specify a group name. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll see you in the next one. If you want to create an image gallery or a slideshow for your website, you can use the slider component. From here, you can drag a slider and drop it inside your container, or you can put it wherever you want. I'm going to place it inside the container, and it takes up the full width of my container. As you can see, this slider has multiple elements. If I expand it, you can see that there are 4 main components here. The mask, which includes our slides, the left arrow link, the right arrow link, and the slide nav, which is this indicator at the bottom. If you click on over, you can check them out and see which one suits your needs. The easing method is also related to the animation and to the transition, and since it's a more advanced topic, we're not going to talk about it now, but later when we start talking about interactions, we will talk about the easing method a lot. Then we have the duration. This is the duration of our transition, and the unit is milliseconds. So here, if I specify 1000, the animation occurs in precisely 1 second. Here we have different options as well. We have the infinite repeat slides. We have disable swipe gestures. By default, the slider has the swipe gestures whenever the user interacts with it on tablet or phone. You can disable this option if you want. You have the autoplay slides option. You have the hide at each end. So what it does is this. If I check this option, it hides the left arrow for the first slide and the right arrow for the last slide. So let's give it a try. Here we don't have the left arrow. Then if I go to the third one, here we don't have the right arrow. So you can customize these options however you want. Then we have the slide nav. This is all about these indicators. So I can check rounded, or you can uncheck that to get these squares. You can check number labels. You can check shadow, invert colors, and also you can specify the spacing in pixels. Like I can specify 10, and I'm gonna uncheck all of them. I'm gonna check rounded. Great. All right. Now let's add content to our slides. A slide can contain any kind of container. You can add some div blocks to it. You can add background images. You can add an image to it. That's totally up to you. But for now, I'm gonna select this slide 1, and I'm gonna scroll down in the style panel, and from the backgrounds, I'm gonna hit image and gradient and choose image. And from my assets, I'm gonna choose one of these images. Cool. And let's set the position to center, and it's gonna cover just like that, and do not tile. For the next one, I'm gonna do the same thing. So let me choose my image just like this. Let me change the position and size. And last but not least, for the last slide, I'm gonna choose another image, this one. Let's change the position to center, and the size is going to be cover and do not tile. Okay. Great. All right, our slider is ready. However, I'm going to modify its height, okay? So I'm going to select the slider. Make sure to select your slider element. And from the size, I can specify a specific height. For example, 500 pixels. It looks much better now. Now, if I click on these indicators, I can move between these images. So now, I'm going to select the slider. And then let's go to the element settings. From here, I'm going to check autoplay slides. And here I can specify the timer delay. By default, it's set to 4000 milliseconds. It means the transition occurs in precisely 4 seconds. If I preview it now, after 4 seconds, the transition occurs. You can modify that. I'm going to set it to 1000. There we go. It's too much. Maybe I can set it to 2000. Now it's better. So as I mentioned before, a slide can contain anything. So here I can add some other elements. For example, a heading. Let's drag and drop a heading inside this slide. And there we go. I can give it a title, slide 1. I can modify its CSS properties, everything. For each slide, I can do the same thing. I can add a paragraph as well here. All right, guys, that's all for the slider component. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next video. Sometimes we might need to have some tabbed content, some interactive tabbed content. In that case, we can use the tabs element. Under the component section, we have the tabs element. One of the most common use cases of tabs is the pricing section of different websites. Here, as you can see, use the tabs element. Under the component section, we have the tabs element. One of the most common use cases of tabs is the pricing section of different websites. Here, as you can see, I prepared 2 different div blocks, and inside there are some other div blocks with some elements. And what we're going to do is put these pricing boxes into tabs, okay? The top row is our monthly plan, and the bottom row is our yearly plan. So we are going to need 2 different tabs. But first, let's go ahead and drag and drop the tabs element into my container, just like that. And by default, as you can see, the tabs element has 3 different tabs, okay? Basically, the tabs element has different components. The tabs menu, which are these tabs at the top, and the tabs content. And inside the tabs content, as you can see, it's a mask. This icon indicates that it's a mask. Inside these tabs content, we have 3 different panes, okay? We have tab pane, tab 1, tab 2, and tab 3. So the content of our tab should be placed inside the tab pane. And whenever we want to modify the tab's name, we need to work with tabs menus, okay? So here, if I just double click on this text, I can modify that. So let's write monthly. And for the next one, I'm going to write yearly. And this third one is not necessary, so I can hit delete or backspace on my keyboard to remove this tab link, just like that. Now I have 2 different tabs. But what about the content? Well, first, I'm going to select this div block, this top pricing box. I'm going to drag it and drop it inside the first tab pane. Make sure that it's nested correctly, okay? Take a look at your navigator and make sure that this is nested inside the tab pane 1, just like that. Now, this pricing box, okay, these boxes are part of tab pane 1, okay? We're gonna do the same thing for this bottom or yearly plan. I'm gonna drag it and drop it, and I'm gonna make sure that it's nested inside tab pane 2, just like that. But now it's invisible, okay? From now on, if I want to check out my tabs content, I need to click on these tab panes. For example, I'm gonna click on tab pane 1. This is our monthly plan, and if I click on tab pane 2, this is our yearly plan. By default, there is no top margin, so I'm going to select tabs content, which is basically a wrapper for our panes, and then I'm going to give it some margin, okay, some top margin, maybe 30 pixels, okay? So let's see what happens now. I'm going to preview it. We are on yearly plan. I'm going to click on monthly. There we go. Can you see this transition? So this is basically how the tabs work. Of course, you can style these tabs, and we will talk about stylings later, but for now, you just need to know how the tab element works. If I want to add more tabs, I can select my tabs element in the navigator, and if I head over to the tab settings, I can click on this add button, just like that, to add more tabs. As you can see, tab 3 has been added here, and I can rearrange my tabs like this. I can set the initial tab that the user sees. For example, it's going to be tab 1. I'm going to remove tab 3 for now. You can rename the tabs here, but just in terms of organization, okay? So if I rename it here, nothing changes on the actual tab, on the actual link, because this is a text, and you need to modify that on the canvas. But if you want to organize them properly, you can you can simply write 1, for example, and for this 2, just like that. You can modify the easing method. For now, you don't know what it is, but we will talk about it later. It's all about the animation. Here, the fade in is set to 300 milliseconds and the fade out is set to 100 milliseconds. It's too fast. So to see the real difference here, I'm going to set it to the fade in is going to be 500 milliseconds and the fade out is going to be 500 milliseconds as well. Now let's preview it. All right, the monthly plan is already selected. I'm going to click on the yearly, and there we go. It's much slower now. All right, so let's recap. The tabs element has 2 main components: tabs menu and tabs content. The tabs menu includes all these tab links at the top. And the tabs content includes our tab panes here, okay? So whenever we want to modify the content of our tabs, we should only head over to the tabs content and select our tab pane, okay? If we want to modify the appearance of our tab links or even the name, the text, we should always go to tabs menu and choose our tab link. All right, that's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one. Adding social media buttons to your website can help drive more traffic to your social media accounts. To do that, you can use the Facebook or the Twitter components. I'm going to start with Facebook. Let me drag and drop it into my container. And as you can see, by default, there is a like button. There is the default like number and this sign up to see what your friends like sentence. And here, you can specify the Facebook account URL, okay? It could be the client's Facebook account or your own Facebook account if you're building your own website. You can modify the layout here from standard to box to button. That's totally up to you. You can specify the width and height here. And also, you can modify the language. For example, I can choose German. I can change it to Spanish, just like that. But for now, let's keep it English. If I preview that, if you click on that, you will be taken to Facebook. But since we didn't specify any account here, we will just go to facebook.com. But if you specify an account here, the user can like that particular account. But what about Twitter? Let me remove this Facebook component. I'm going to drag and drop a component, the Twitter component here, and let's see what we have here. We have different options, button types like tweet or follow. If you want the user to tweet something, you can choose the tweet, and here you can specify the website's URL. Here, you can specify a tweet text like, check it out. Okay, and then you can decide whether the bubble should be shown or not, just like that. And you can modify the layout. Here we have the horizontal layout, you can change it to vertical, or the size, you can change it to large. Okay, I'm gonna hide the bubble for now. And now let's preview that. If I preview it and I click on this, there we go. I can see this check it out webflow.com. This is the URL that we can specify when we are modifying the preferences of that component. Okay, if I go to follow, here I can specify the account's username, okay, without the @ sign, because the @ sign is already there. I can write my account's username, and immediately the number of followers of that particular account will be shown here. Okay, I'm gonna hide the bubble for now, and let's make it larger. Now let's see what happens. If I click on it, I can decide whether I want to follow this page or not. Since this is my own page, I'm not gonna follow that. So let's move back. This is all about social media components. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you then. If you want to add the search functionality to your website, you can use the search element, actually this search component here, under the components section. This is a very powerful component because you don't need to worry about indexing your pages and prepare your search results. What you need to do is just drag and drop it into your canvas. I'm gonna put it inside my section, as you can see here. Let me add a container here that you could see it easily. I'm gonna put it inside my container. All right, now it looks better. And also I'm gonna modify the color of the search word to white. All right, now it's quite visible. So this is just a text field, and if you double click on it, you can find this placeholder property here that you can modify. You can enable or disable the autofocus as well. That's totally up to you. One thing to mention is that when you add a search element to your canvas, a new page, a new utility page is created automatically for you. So if you go to the pages here, you can see that under utility pages, we have this new search results page. If I click on that, there we go. You can see that we've got some sample results here, okay? So let me modify the color of these text as well to white, and this one to white as well. Okay, cool. So this is basically what the user sees. You can easily style it, but you need to understand that it doesn't work for all websites and all plans. Why? If you go to the settings here and you go to search, you can see that it says once you've set up CMS or business hosting, Webflow automatically indexes the content of your published site to create an up-to-date search index. So without the CMS or business hosting, you cannot use this search functionality. If you want to work on a client project and they need this search functionality, you need to make sure to add either the CMS hosting or the business hosting to your project. We will talk about these plans later, but for now, you just need to know that this functionality exists, and if you need a search bar, you can use that. As designers and developers, we always try not to repeat ourselves. So we want to avoid copying and pasting and redoing everything again and again and again. To do so, we need to learn how we can create an element once and reuse it multiple times across our project. How can we do that? Well, we can use symbols. If I go to the add section and I try to drag and drop a nav bar here, just like that, I'm going to place it right below my body. All right, here we have a navigation bar. And let's suppose we want to turn it into a symbol. How can we do that? We have different ways to do so. First, we can go to the symbols page here, and then we can hit the create new symbol button, and we need to name our symbol. I'm going to name it nav bar. And create symbol. And as you can see, it turns green, okay? A green boundary appears here, and it means that our symbol has been created successfully. But now we are inside the master symbol. You can press escape to exit the master symbol, or you can click on this green back to instance button. So here we have a symbol. How can we reuse that? Well, let's go ahead and create a new page. I'm gonna go to pages, and from here, I'm gonna click on create new page, okay? Let's name it. I'm gonna name it contact and create. All right, now we have an empty canvas. I'm gonna go to symbols. From here, we have our nav bar. If I drag and drop it here, there we go. Let's go ahead and create a new page. I'm gonna go to pages, and from here, I'm gonna click on create new page, okay? Let's name it. I'm gonna name it contact and create. All right, now we have an empty canvas. I'm going to go to symbols. From here, we have our nav bar. If I drag and drop it here, there we go, we've got our nav bar. But wait, can't we just copy and paste it instead of creating symbols? Yes, we can, but it's not an efficient way. Why? Because when you copy and paste an element, if you make any change to one of those elements, that change is unique to that particular element, and it doesn't affect the duplicated elements. But when you use symbols, let me show you how it works. Let's suppose I want to change this contact text to contact us instead. To do that, first you need to go to the master symbol, okay? If you double click on that, as you can see, now we are inside the master symbol, and I can double click on this text, and I'm going to modify that to contact us. Then I'm going to hit the back to instance button here. All right, now we change it here in our contact page. If I go back to my home page, you can see that the change has been applied automatically to this instance as well. So when you work with symbols, you make changes once, and the changes apply automatically to all instances of that particular symbol. It's so powerful because imagine you have 100 different pages on your website, and if you want to just manually go ahead and modify here, just like that, I'm going to place it right below my body. All right, here we have a navigation bar, and let's suppose we want to turn it into a symbol. How can we do that? We have different ways to do so. First, we can go to the symbols page here, and then we can hit the create new symbol button, and we need to name our symbol. I'm going to name it navbar and create symbol. And as you can see, it turns green, okay? A green boundary appears here, and it means that our symbol has been created successfully. But now we are inside the master symbol. You can press escape to exit the master symbol, or you can click on this green back to instance button. So here we have a symbol. Suppose I want to change this contact page. If I go back to my home page, you can see that the change has been It's usually useful for creating navigation bars, footers. We will talk about the use cases later. But for now, I'm going to show you how you can use them and how you can modify the content, how you can override the content here. So far we've learned how to create a symbol, how to reuse a symbol, how to edit a symbol, and now we're going to talk about overriding, how we can override the content of our symbols. Here I created a simple card with some elements, a heading, an image, a paragraph, and a button, okay? I'm going to turn it into a symbol. The other way of creating a symbol is to just right click on your element, and from here you can choose create symbol, just like that. Now we can name it, let's say card. All right, our card symbol is ready. Now what I'm going to do is copy and paste it 2 times. So I'm going to hit Command C or Control C and Command V or Control V 2 times. So these 2 new cards are instances of our card symbol. If I make any changes to the first card, for example, if I change the size of this image, the changes apply immediately to other cards as well. If I modify this heading to H2, you can see that the changes apply to all the instances. But how can we override the content of these 2 instances? Since we have 3 different cards, and for sure we are not going to use the same content for all cards, we need to learn how we can override content. To do that, first you need to create some fields for your symbols. So I'm going to double click on this symbol to go to the master symbol, and I will be able to edit things. And then I'm going to select the element that I want to create a field for, okay? I'm going to start with this image because this image should be replaceable. I'm going to select that, and if I go to the image settings here at the top, I can see that there is image settings here, and I have this purple button right on the top left corner. If I hover over that, you can see that it turns to a plus button. I'm going to click on it, and then I'm going to hit new field, just like that. And as you can see, it says this new field will automatically be linked to this image override, and I'm going to name it image, okay? Create and link. It says you've just created and linked an override field. All right, cool. Now I'm going to select this heading, and from here, I'm going to click on this link to field, create new field, and let's call it title. Create and link, great. I'm going to do the same thing for the paragraph. Let's create a new field, and here I'm going to write description, create and link, and that's all. I'm not going to create a field for the button, but if you want, you can do that as well. So how does it work? First, let me exit the master symbol. I'm going to click on back to instance. And now if I select my second card, on the right side, you can see that we have instance overrides. We have the image. These are the fields that we just created. We have the image, the title, and the description. Each field has a default content, okay? So I'm going to replace this image simply with this. I'm going to modify the text here to card 2, and we can modify the paragraph as well, just like that. And then let me choose the third card, and we're going to do the same thing for this one. This one is going to be card 3, and for this one, I'm going to remove the first sentence, just like that. So this is basically how you can override your symbol's content. The last thing I'm going to talk about is unlinking your symbols. How can you unlink a symbol? There are times that you want to make some changes and you want these changes to be applied to a specific element, okay? To do that, first select your symbol, right click on it, and from here you can find unlink instance. If you click on edit main symbol, you will be taken to the master symbol and you will be able to edit it. But if you unlink instance, just like that, now it's just a simple div. As you can see, it's no longer a symbol, and you can recognize that from the navigator because here the icon of these symbols is green, okay? But this is just a simple div block. Now, if I change the dimension of this image, this change is unique to this particular card. Alright guys, that's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey, in this video, we're going to talk about Webflow's shortcuts. When we work on a project, we may need to use some shortcuts to accelerate our design process. And in this video, I'm going to talk about the most important ones because there are many different shortcuts that you can use, but we're not going to talk about all of them because most of the time we want to use all those shortcuts. So if you head over to the bottom left corner of Webflow here, you can see this question mark. If you click on it, here on the help panel, we have different options. And the second option is keyboard shortcuts. I'm going to click on it, and there it is. As I mentioned before, you may not need all of them, but some of them are so important to know, like copy and paste, undo, redo, find, etc. So whenever you want to copy something, you can use Command C or Control C if you're using Windows. If you want to cut something, you can use Command X or Control X, and if you want to paste something, you can use Command V or Control V. Basically, if you're a Mac user, you need to use Command. If you are a Windows user, you need to use Control. So here, for instance, for duplicate, it says Option plus drag. So if you hold the Option key on your keyboard and you click and drag, you can duplicate an element. On Windows, instead of Option, you need to hold the Alt key on your keyboard. And here, as you can see, for undo, we use Command Z or Control Z, and for redo, we use Command Shift and Z. The other go to another breakpoint. For example, if you want to go to the tablet breakpoint, you can hit number 2 on your keyboard. If you want to go to mobile portrait, you can hit number 4. Using these shortcuts is optional, but believe me, it's going to make your life much easier if you learn them. The other important shortcut that we use almost all the time is Find. There is a very good feature called Quick Find, and when you want to open it up, you can hit Command E or Command K or Control E or Control K. We will talk about Quick Find later, but for now, you just need to know how you can use these shortcuts. So if you want to learn more about these shortcuts, you can head over to the Help panel and click on Keyboard Shortcuts and just check them out. But for now, these are the most important shortcuts that you need to know about. Alright guys, that's all for this video. Almost all modern websites nowadays are created using classes. And when you want to open it up, because classes let us store our styling information and then reuse them again and again and again for as many elements as we want. That's why classes are so... Almost all modern websites nowadays are created using classes. Why? Because classes let us store our styling information and then reuse them again and again and again for as many elements as we want. That's why classes are so powerful, and it's almost impossible to create a modern web page without classes. Let me show you how it works. When you add an element to your canvas, for example, a div block, just like this, you can head over to the Style panel on the right side, and at the top we have the Select Your section, okay? Here is where we will add a class, or let's say select a class. By default, our elements don't have any class, and if we want to modify the CSS properties of our elements, we need to add a specific class to that. If we don't, Webflow automatically assigns a class to this particular element. Let's see how it works. First, I'm not going to add any class here. I just want to modify the background color, and there we go. As soon as I changed one of these properties, this div block class has been created automatically. If you want to rename our class, we can just left click on it and simply rename it. I'm going to call it div, okay? So this is basically how you can create a class. The other way, which is better in my opinion, is to just create a class once you added your element to your canvas, okay? So instead of modifying the properties of your element, first add a class to it. This way you can make sure that your classes are organized, because later on we're going to reuse these classes, and naming them properly is so important. So now I'm going to select this div block, and there is no class here because I just removed that. Let me show you how you can remove a class. I'm going to write div, choose this class that I created. To remove a class, you can just click on this down arrow and just hit remove class. Alternatively, you can click somewhere here, and as you can see, this cursor is blinking. If you hit the delete or backspace key on your keyboard, this class will be removed. Alright, so now we don't have any class applied to this element. I'm gonna click here, and I can start creating a new class. So we need to name our class here. I'm gonna write new div. Enter, just like that. Our class has been created, and we didn't modify the properties of this element yet. So if I scroll down, you can see that there are some properties, and they are highlighted with this amber color. It means that this particular property is inherited from another class. If I click on that, you can see that value comes from body all pages. We will talk about these tags later, but for now you just need to know that this amber color means that actually the property and styling is coming from somewhere else. Of course, you can override that, and once you override that, see what happens. It turns blue. It means that this property is now coming from this class. Okay, if I click on it, you can see that we can reset this property, and resetting will inherit the value from body all pages. Okay, so now let's go ahead and modify the background. I'm going to change it to white. Why do we need to use classes? Well, as I mentioned before, classes store information about our styling. So now that we modify the background color and also the font, we can just reuse this class. How to reuse the class? First, let me go ahead and add another div block here, and I'm going to place it right next to it. And now instead of creating a new class, I can just apply the new div class to this particular div block. I'm going to write new. I can find it under the existing classes here, and there we go. One thing you need to remember is that we are making changes to the style. We are not making changes to the element itself. That's why we can apply a class to any element, okay? We set the properties for a specific class, and then we can apply it to any kind of element. So now I'm going to go ahead and change the background color, and let's see what happens. There we go. As you can see, the change applied to both these div blocks because both these elements are using this new div class. But what if I want to have a unique class for the second div block? To do so, we can duplicate the class. We can just click on this down arrow, and I'm going to hit duplicate class, and let's write second div. Just like that. Now, there is no connection between this div block and this div block because we just duplicated the class and there is no relationship between these two classes. So if I decide to modify the color here, the background color, the change I make here only applies to this particular element. But how can you rename a class? To rename a class, you can simply click on it and just rename it. I'm going to change it to demo. Now our class has been renamed. So let me show you another example. I'm going to go to the add section, and from here, I'm going to bring a button into my canvas. Just like that. Let me put it inside my container, and I'm going to remove these div blocks. Alright, cool. So this button has no class, okay? I'm going to add a class to it. I'm going to write primary button. Cool. Now this primary button has some default stylings because this is a pre-built element, and I'm going to override these elements. I'm going to start with the spacing. Okay, here we have different properties, and I can modify the padding. I'm going to hold down the Option key on my keyboard or Alt key and just left click and drag to modify the padding from both sides simultaneously, just like that. And as you can see, it turned blue, and it means that these properties are coming from this class, this particular class. All right, now let's make another change to this button. I'm going to modify its color to something else. Okay, cool. And now what I'm going to do is add another button here. There we go. And I'm going to apply the same class to this new button. So let's look for primary button. All the stylings have been applied to this new button as well. But what if I want to create variations for my button? Well, in this case, we can use something very useful, a combo class. A combo class is a type of class that is built upon your base class. Right now, we have created a base class, okay? And if I want to create a combo class, I can just click over here, and as you can see, it says new combo class. Why? Because we already have the base class, and we can create a combo class on top of this base class. So let's write light. But nothing happened. Of course nothing happened because we didn't change anything. Now that we created this combo class, this element is inheriting the styling from two different classes. It first inherits all the properties from the primary button class, and then it inherits more properties from the light class. So first, all the properties of the primary button class will be applied to this button, and then if we modify something here, since we created a combo class, it overrides those properties from the primary button. It's so powerful. Let's suppose I want to create a light button here. I'm going to modify the color to white, and as you can see, it turns blue, and I'm going to modify the typography color here to black, just like that. So let me explain what happened. As you can see, the spacing didn't change, and we have this amber color here. It means that these properties are coming from our primary button class. However, if we head over to the background section, you can see that we have this blue color. And it means that this color, this particular property comes from the light combo class. But to understand it better, I'm going to select the primary button. As you can see, there is only one class applied. We don't have any combo class. And I'm going to modify the padding from 30 to 40, okay? Just like that. And as you can see, the change I made here automatically applied to this button, although we had a combo class. Why? Because when we created the combo class, we didn't touch the spacing property. We only modified the background color. That's how combo classes work. They are built on top of our base class. Apart from these two classes, the base class and the combo class, we have another type of class, which is called a global class. Let me show you how it works. I'm going to go ahead and drag and drop a div block here into my container. There we go. This is an empty div block. I'm going to go ahead and assign a class to it. So I'm going to create a new class and let's call it shadow. I'm going to put it outside my container that you could see it better, okay? It's right here at the top. And I gave it this shadow class. Now I'm going to go to the effects section, and from here, I'm going to click on this plus button to add some shadows to this particular div block, okay? As you can see, the shadow has been added here. I'm going to modify the properties, the blur amount, and the size, and let me modify the opacity as well. Okay, cool. And now we have a global class. What does it mean? Whenever we want to apply some specific stylings to many elements on our web page, we can use global classes. For example, let's suppose we have different buttons and we have different images. Let me go ahead and drag and drop an image here that you could see it better. I'm going to decrease its width to 300 pixels. All right, cool. So let's suppose we want to have a consistent drop shadow for all our elements. In this case, I'm going to select my primary button here and I'm going to add our global class to it. So let's look for shadow. As you can see, it says global combo classes. There we go. The shadow has been added here. Now I'm going to select this primary button and here I'm going to write shadow. There we go, the shadow has been applied. And let's do the same thing for this image. There is no class here. So first, I'm going to give it a class, image, and then I'm going to add the shadow global class to that, just like that. So as you can see, now these three elements use our shadow global class. But what if I want to modify the properties of this shadow global class? I can select this div block. This is a temporary element. I can simply remove that and nothing happens. But if I want to modify the properties of this global class, I'm going to need to select this div block. And let's suppose I want to change, let's say, size amount here. As you can see, the changes apply to all those elements that are using our global class. If you're familiar with different design software like Figma or Sketch, for sure you have used styles. In Figma, we can create color styles, typography styles. This is the exact same concept. We create our styles once and we apply them to multiple elements again and again and again. And this way, when we want to make some changes, we can do it once and the changes apply immediately to all the elements that are using that specific class. Alright guys, that's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope now you have a better understanding of classes. We will use classes almost all the time when we work on our projects. So make sure to understand the concept of classes properly since we are going to use them across our projects. I'll see you in the next video. Any website you visit nowadays is using one of the 6 display settings here. If you head over to the layout section on the right side, you can see that we have 6 different display settings. In this video, we're going to talk about each of these display settings, what is the difference between them, how you can use them, and when you should use each of them. It's important to learn these display settings very, very well because if you don't, it's very hard for you to create different layouts for your projects. So make sure to pay attention to the details because sometimes the difference is subtle. However, in real world projects, it makes a difference. Alright, so without further ado, let's get started. First of all, I'm going to go ahead and add a heading into this container. I'm going to go ahead and select this container and remove this top padding. I don't need that. Now we have this heading. Let me give it a class. I'm going to write h1, okay? And then I'm going to go ahead and modify its color that you could see it better. Alright, any element like heading, paragraph, div block, button, etc. use the block display setting by default. So here we have 6 different display settings. We have the block, we have the flex or flex box, we have the grid, we have the inline block, we have the inline, and finally we have none. As you can see, by default, it has the block display setting. What does it mean? When the display setting is set to block, it means that your element takes up the whole width of its parent. So in this case, the parent of this element is container. And as you can see, when I select this h1 element, this boundary takes up the whole width of this container, okay? The width of this container is set to 1100 pixels. Therefore, the difference is subtle. However, in real world projects, it makes a difference. Alright, so without further ado, let's get started. First of all, I'm going to go ahead and add a heading into this container. I'm going to go ahead and select this container and remove this top padding. I don't need that. Now we have this heading. Let me give it a class. I'm going to write h1, okay? And then I'm going to go ahead and modify its color that you could see it better. Alright, any element like heading, paragraph, div block, button, etc. use the block display setting by default. So here we have 6 different display settings. We have the block, we have the flex or flex box, we have the grid, we have the inline block, we have the inline, and finally we have none. As you can see, by default, it has the block display setting. What does it mean? When the display setting is set to block, it means that your element takes up the whole width of its parent. So in this case, the parent of this element is container. And as you can see, when I select this h1 element, this boundary takes up the whole width of this container, okay? The width of this container is set to 1100 pixels. Therefore, this h1 element takes up 1100 pixels here as well. And one more important thing is that if I add more elements here, since this heading is set to block, if I add more headings, just like that, you can see that it takes the next available line. It won't sit right next to this heading. This is how the block element behaves. So let me give it the h1 tag, just like that. And if I copy and paste it multiple times, you can see that each of these elements takes up the whole width of its parent, which is in this case the container. That's why they cannot sit next to each other. The next display setting we're going to talk about is called flex or flex box. It's one of the most important display settings we can work with for web development. So let me show you how it works. Unlike the block display setting that is applied to the element itself, the flex display setting is applied to the parent of our elements. In this case is this container, okay? So we don't select our element and change the display setting to flexbox. Why? Because flexbox is used for aligning different elements either horizontally or vertically. So let me show you how it works. Let's suppose we have multiple headings here, just like that. We have 3 different headings and the display setting of these headings is set to block, okay? So they take up the whole width of this container. Then if I select this container, as you can see by default, the display setting is set to block. If I change it to flexbox, see what happens. Now these elements are aligned next to each other. And here under the layout, I have different properties to work with. I have direction. By default, it's set to horizontal. I can set it to vertical to stand Here's how it works. Let's suppose we have multiple headings here, just like that. We have 3 different headings, and the display setting of these headings is set to block. Okay, so they take up the whole width of this container. Then if I select this container, as you can see by default, the display setting is set to block. If I change it to flexbox, see what happens. Now these elements are aligned next to each other, and here under the layout, I have different properties to work with. I have direction. By default, it's set to horizontal. I can set it to vertical to stack them vertically. I can align the element to the center, both horizontally and vertically. I can align these elements however I want. But for now, you just need to know that whenever we want to create one-dimensional layouts, we can use flexbox. But what if I want to create two-dimensional layouts? In that case, we need to use a grid. And you're right, we already talked about grid. And if you remember, I told you that we can turn any kind of box into a grid. And this is exactly what I meant. So here, if I change the display setting from flexbox to grid, look what happens. Now we have a 2x2 grid. And now I can modify my grid however I want. Basically, you can turn a div block into a grid, a container into a grid, because you can change the display setting of those elements easily. Okay, so if you have a container and you want to turn it to a grid, you can simply change the display setting here, and then you will get a grid. All right, now let's talk about the inline block. Okay, first I'm gonna set it back to block display setting. If I want these headings to sit next to each other, I can use the inline block. So let's turn it to inline block, and there we go. As you can see, now these elements sit next to each other, and they don't take up the whole width of their parent, which is this container. It's good for when you want to create some tags that they need to be placed next to each other, or other different use cases. But what about the inline? This one is called inline block. We have the inline as well. If I turn it to inline, let's see what happens. The main difference between the inline block and inline is that the inline doesn't respect the spacing property, so you cannot modify the spacing properties here, but you can modify the typography properties, or let's say the backgrounds property. Let's give it a try. Now that our display setting is set to inline, I'm going to change the background here to something else, just like that. And I can't modify the padding or margin. But why should we ever use the inline display setting when we can't modify the padding or margin? Well, let me show you a very good use case for that. I'm going to remove these headings. I'm going to go to the add section, and from here, I'm going to drag and drop a paragraph into my container. Okay, now let me go ahead and change the color of this paragraph. But first, let me give it a tag. I'm going to call it P for paragraph, and let me change it to white. By default, this paragraph is using the block display setting, and that's totally fine. First, let me modify the width of this paragraph. I'm going to set it to 500 pixels. Just like that. And let me increase the font size a little bit. Cool. And also the line height, I'm going to set it to 150%. We will talk about these units later. But for now, I just want you to focus on this paragraph. Right now, this paragraph has some styling. Okay, it uses the P class, and this P class has some styling. What if I want to style a specific word here differently? Well, in that case, I can select that particular word, for example, this one. And then from here, I'm going to click on this icon, this brush icon, and it says wrap with span. Let's see what it does. If I click on that, it creates a text span. And this text span by default is using the inline display setting. We can modify the padding or margin. Even if we want to change the size properties here, it doesn't affect this word. Let me prove it to you. I'm going to write 500 here. As you can see, nothing happens because the inline display setting doesn't respect the size or spacing properties. All right, let me reset that for now. Since we created this text span, I'm going to go ahead and call it highlight. There we go. And what I'm going to do is change the background color of this particular text span. I'm going to head over to the background section here, and let me change the background color to something else like this. Okay, let me make it lighter, and then I'm going to modify the typography property here just like that. As you can see, we could style this particular word using a text span, and this text span is using the inline display. So this is a very good use case of the inline display setting. And if we have multiple paragraphs in our project like this, and we want to just highlight another word, we can simply choose that word, wrap it with a span, and from here, I'm going to give it the same class that we just created, highlight. There we go. And if I modify the properties here, since it's just a class, the changes apply immediately to all the elements that are using this particular class. So let me modify that. There we go. All right, now let's move on to the last display setting, which is none. None actually hides the elements. Let me show you how it works. I'm going to go ahead and remove these paragraphs, and here inside this container, I'm going to add a div block, okay? Just like this. And this div block is going to have a class. I'm going to write new card, and then I'm going to change its background color to white. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and add some more elements into this particular div block. So let me start with adding a heading, and then I'm going to add a paragraph here, and finally I'm going to add a button, just like that. Okay, and then let me select this new card div block and modify its height. Okay, by default it's set to auto. I'm going to change it to 400 pixels. As I mentioned before, by default the heading and paragraph are using the block display setting. But what if I want to hide an element here? Well, let's see what happens if I click on this non-display setting, the last option. There we go. Now it's hidden, and if I turn it back, just like that, you can see that now it's visible. But you may say, can't we just decrease the opacity of this element? Let's see what's the difference between turning the opacity down and setting the display setting to none. I'm going to select this paragraph, and from the typography section, I'm going to decrease the opacity of these elements using this slider. There we go. It's not visible. However, it's still there. As you can see, it takes up some space. And if I preview it, you can see that something is there, and I can select this text, but it's not visible. So in this case, it's better to use a display none. Okay. One thing to mention is that when you use the display none setting here, the element still shows up in your code. It just disappears on the page and from the interface. It doesn't take up any space, but it's still there in our code. So if you want to remove something completely from your code, you need to remove that element. To do that, you can just hit the delete or backspace button on your keyboard, or you can right click on your element and click on delete. Alright guys, that's all for this video. In the next video, we're going to talk about flexbox in detail. So see you then. In the previous video, we talked about all the display settings that you can use for your layouts. And in this video, we're going to dive into the details of using flexbox. As I mentioned before, flexbox is very useful for one-dimensional layouts. And I'm going to show you some useful examples that you could truly understand how you can use different features and different properties of a flexbox. Here, as you can see, I created some simple cards. If I go to this wrapper, I have 3 different cards. As you can see, each card has one image, one heading, and one text block. Nothing fancy. But their alignment is not what I want. Actually, I want them to sit next to each other. And for this, what we can do is use a flexbox. Whenever you want to align some elements, you need to make sure not to set the display setting of those elements to flexbox. That's wrong. Let me show you what happens if I select this card, for example, the first one, and I turn the display setting to align some elements. Their alignment is not what I want. Actually, I want them to sit next to each other. And for this, what we can do is use a flexbox. Whenever you want to align some elements, you need to make sure not to set the display setting of those elements to flexbox. That's wrong. Let me show you what happens. If I select this card, for example, the first one, and I turn the display setting to flexbox, this is what happens, and it's not our intent. So you need to always make sure to choose the parent of those elements. In this case, the parent of these cards is this wrapper, okay? I'm gonna select the wrapper, which is the parent, and I'm gonna turn it into a flexbox. There we go. Now these cards sit next to each other, and if I want them to stack vertically, I can change the direction from horizontal to vertical, just like that. For now, I'm gonna keep it horizontal, and let's talk about the alignment and the justification. When I turn anything to a flexbox, I can control the alignment of its children. Right now, the children of this flexbox are these cards. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna show you how the alignment works. If I change the alignment now, you can see what's going on. Why? Because the height of this wrapper is set to auto. Let me set a specific height for this wrapper. I'm gonna set it to 500 pixels. Now, as you can see, these cards are stretched because the align option is set to stretch. But what if I want them to be aligned to the center, both horizontally and vertically? The justification is set to center. If I change the align option to center as well, this is what happens. And as you can see, this first card is smaller. The reason is, if I click on this card, you can see that the height is set to auto. And here, on these two cards, we have 4 lines of text, and here we have only 3 lines of text. So if I just go ahead and add some dummy words here, you can see that we will get the same height here now. Alright, now let's talk about the alignment. I can align it to the top, to the bottom, to the center. I can set it to stretch. I can change the justification to the left, to the middle, to the right. And these two justifications are so important. This one says space between, okay? So let's see what happens. If I click on that, it distributes an even spacing between these cards. However, the first card will stick to the left side of the boundary, which is this wrapper, and the right card will stick to the right side of this boundary, okay? But if I change the justification to the last option, space around, you can see that we have an even spacing between cards, but the first and last cards are not attached to the edges of this wrapper. So this is the main difference between them. Most of the time we use space between. It's much safer to work with this option, but you just need to understand the difference between these options. Alright, so far we have been working with the parent element, okay? But when we turn the parent element to a flexbox, the child itself has some properties as well. The child here is this card, okay? I'm gonna select the card, and on the right side you can see that we have a flex child, and we have different options here. We have sizing, and then we have alignment and order. If I click on this, you can see we will get some options as well. So let's see what's gonna happen if I change the sizing option. We have 3 different sizing options here. The first one says shrink if needed, and by default it's set to this option, and it means if we go to other breakpoints, for example smaller devices like this, it shrinks, okay? Since it's needed, since we don't have that much space. But let's check out the next option, which says grow if possible. If I click on that, as you can see, there is no space in between, and it fills up the whole space within our wrapper. So this is the difference between them. Then we have don't shrink or grow. So now if I go to the tablet breakpoint, you can see that they don't shrink, and it's not good actually in terms of responsiveness. And you can also use the manual option, but I've never used that, and it's better to avoid it since it's gonna make your life much complicated. So I'm gonna change it to shrink if needed. Now let's talk about alignment and order. So here we have align and we have order. Sometimes we might need to change the order of our cards. Of course, we can do that within the navigator like this, but we can also do that here using the flex child options. If I select this card and I add a combo class, for example, let's call it summer. And I want it to always be the last card, I can set it to last, and there we go. The placement has been changed. I can change it to first, and I can set it to don't change. Again, I can use the customize order as well, but most of the time we use first and last, and order. So here we have align and we have order. Sometimes we might need to change the order of our cards, of course, and I add a combo class, for example, let's call it summer, and I want it to always be the last card, I can set it to last, and there we go. The placement has been changed. I can change it to first, and I can set it to don't change. Again, I can use the customize order as well, but most of the time we use first and last, just like that. Let's talk about the alignment. So let's suppose I want to align this first card differently. I can do that. I can select this card. Since a combo class has been added to this child, I can change the alignment to top, center, bottom, or again, stretch or baseline. I'm gonna go with auto. The auto takes the alignment that we set to the parent element here, stretch. But sometimes, for some reasons, we might need to override those preferences, those properties that we set for the parent element. Alright, now let's take a look at another example. Here at the bottom, I created some link blocks. These are some simple link blocks, and I created some tags here. As you can see, there is a wrapper called tags, and all these tags are inside this wrapper. If I select this tags wrapper and I turn it into a flexbox, look what happens. As you can see, nothing is organized and our tags are destroyed. So how can we fix that? It's very simple. Can you see this children option here, which says don't wrap by default? If I set it to wrap, it wraps all our children, okay? These tags are the children of this tags wrapper. And now I have access to this advanced align option. Here I can set it to align rows start. Now this tags wrapper wraps all the children inside. If I go ahead and copy and paste these tags again and again, you can see that they are aligned perfectly as expected. So can you see how powerful it is to work with flexbox? So let's take a look at the order once again. So here, if I want this UI UX design tag to always be our last element, I can give it a specific combo class. For example, I'm gonna write UI UX, and then I'm gonna change the order to last, just like that. Alright guys, that's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you in the next one.
क्या है बहन चोदी है?
And I created some tags here. As you can see, there is a wrapper called tags, and all these tags are inside this wrapper. If I select this tags wrapper and I turn it into a flexbox, look what happens. As you can see, nothing is organized. our tags are destroyed. So how can we fix that? It's very simple. Can you see this children option here, which says don't wrap by default? If I set it to wrap, it wraps all our children, okay? These tags are the children of this tags wrapper. And now I have access to this advanced align option. Here I can set it to align rows start. Now this tags wrapper wraps all the children inside. If I go ahead and copy and paste these tags again and again, you can see that they are aligned perfectly as expected. So can you Now that you've learned how to work with Flexbox, it's time to challenge your skills. Webflow has created a very cool Flexbox game in order for you to practice what you learn. So if you go to flexboxgame.com, you can preview this game and you can actually play this game. You can do some exercises. There are 28 different CSS Flexbox challenges that you can solve in order to see whether you truly understand how the Flexbox works or not. So what I want you to do is go ahead and solve these challenges one by one from level 1 all the way through 28, okay? As you move on from level 1 to level 28, it gets harder and harder to solve these challenges. But don't worry, I'm pretty sure that you can solve them. And what matters is that you try to solve them. It doesn't matter how much time it takes to solve them. What matters is to try. In the next video, we will solve all these challenges together. So see you in the next one.
Let's go. Flexbox. W. एक सेकंड
Understand how the Flexbox works. 28 different CSS. If you go to Flexbox,
no the green color. Move the green circle to the outline using flex layout settings. ओके हाँ, ये साइड में चिपका देता है एंड ये नहीं चिपकाता है साइड में. Easy as fuck भाई. सर्कल को क्लिक करूँगा तो कुछ नहीं होगा. ओके सो इसको मैं रिवर्स किया तो ये हो गया. ओके आप थोड़े हार्ड आने लगे. ऑल फ्लेक्स आइटम्स ट्राई टू फिट ऑन वन लाइन. क्या ये? ओके अच्छा, ये एक की लाइन में आ रहे हैं, इनको अपन को एक एक बॉक्स में डालना है। 1 2 3 4 8 है, नहीं सॉरी 9 है, ये भी 9 है, हाँ ओके। बैंड सो व्हाट द फक। तो ये हो कैसा रहा है? अपन अगर इसको देखें इधर, सबसे पहले लेवल, लेवल के बाद कॉलम, कॉलम 1, कॉलम 2, कॉलम 2 के अंदर प्लेग्राउंड कंटेनर, ये गाइड्स है। अच्छा गाइड के अंदर डालने वाला सीखा था अपन ने, गाइड है एंड दीज आर सर्कल्स, नॉर्मल सर्कल बना रखे हैं ये तो इसने, जो कि वो है डिव ब्लॉक्स है शायद, डिव ब्लॉक ही है हाँ। डिव ब्लॉक को ग्रेड में कर रहा है, तो अपन ने इसको लेआउट में जाके चिल्ड्रन को रैप कर दिया। रैप करने के बाद लाइक अपन अलग अलग तरीके से अलाइन कर सकते हैं इसे, एंड मिडल, स्टार्ट, और ये जो बीच वाला है स्ट्रेच, ये स्पेस बिटवीन और स्ट्रेच, और ये है कि थोड़ा स्पेस इनके बीच में, ठीक है। अभी स्टार्ट पेपर को मिडल वाला कर देना, नहीं सॉरी अच्छा एंड वाला कर देना, एंड टू एंड वाला, यस। ऐसे तो गांड फाड़ है। आ, पहले तो इनको वर्टिकल करेंगे अपन सबसे पहले तो, ठीक है। उसके बाद 3 3 3 है ना, तो लेट्स ट्राई टू, ही हो गया। डोंट वार्प करूँ और इसको वर्टिकल हॉरिजॉन्टल करूँ, और अब इसको वार्प करूँ, तो ये 5 में क्यों हो रहा है? 4 में होना चाहिए इसको। पता नहीं। कुछ तो चुनिए सेटिंग्स. हो गया. अच्छा 5 तो अपनी जगह पे है और एक को लाना है. तो आई थिंक अपन इसमें इस सेटिंग पे चेंज कर सकते हैं इसको सिलेक्ट करके. लिख देता हूँ ग्रीन. हाँ मैंने जो भी अब लिख दिया. और अच्छा इसके तो इसके अंदर वाले होंगे. पता नहीं. एंड अगर मैं इसमें भी ग्रीन लिखूँ मतलब क्या ग्रीन नाम था ना उसका. ना यार. ये क्या है बेंचो. पहले तो नहीं था ये. इसमें गया एंड देन मैंने ये क्लिक किया. क्या इसमें बेंचो पता नहीं क्या. अच्छा फ्लैक्स लोडी तो भी ऑर्डर है. ओके ओके. तो इसमें इसको करके कर देते हैं. पहले तो इसको मिडल में लाते हैं एंड इसको करते हैं अपन रोटेट. ठीक है. तो 1 तो हो गया सॉल्व. अब अपन क्या करेंगे 2 को सिलेक्ट करेंगे एंड ऊपर ला के पैडिंग डाल देंगे. सॉरी. पहले तो इसको स्ट्रेच कर लेते हैं आई गेस, बाद में 1 को एडजस्ट कर लेंगे, ऐसा कुछ कि ये कर लिया अपन ने एंड रोटेटेड दिस शिट, ठीक है। अब इसको नीचे ले आते हैं अपन, तो ऐसे कर लेंगे, 4 5 सॉल्व हो गया, 2 को पैंट चोद सॉर्टेड भाई। दिस ये तो इजी है। वैसे मैं तो एक सिलेक्ट किया था, सबके सब कैसे हो गए? अच्छा, सब में सेम सेटिंग अप्लाइड है, हाँ। हाँ, इसमें भी लिख रखा है, ठीक है। पहले इनको अपन एक डाउट है कि कौन सी चेंज हुई है इसमें। इन दोनों में एक क्लास अप्लाई करके STREPC डाल दी, इसमें भी डाल देता हूँ। जो इसने 200 बताया है वो अगर अपन लिखे यहाँ पे पेंसिल, सॉरी अच्छा अच्छा, अब एक बार कर लिया अपन ने अगर, नाउ वी कैन बूम। ओके। अच्छा, ये इससे नहीं करना था। ग्रीन से सिलेक्ट करना है। हम्म, इनको नीचे लाना है ना, तो अगर मैं इसको बड़ा कर दूँ एकदम ही, तो ये जगह बचेगी नहीं इनके लिए, और इसको फर्स्ट कर दूँ। सो इसको फर्स्ट कर दिया मैंने, एंड इसकी विड्थ को मैंने हो जाएगा उससे, लेकिन मेरे को ऐसा लग रहा है। ऐसा नहीं होगा ये। भाई माँ की चूत इसकी, कैसे बड़ा होगा ये? इसकी हाइट बड़ी करनी है, कैसे करें कैसे करें? अच्छा वेट, फक नहीं हो गया। हम्म नहीं हुआ। बीच में नहीं है ना वो, थोड़ा सा ऊपर है। इतना टाइम नहीं है।
Up, you can hit game.com, you can preview this game, and you can actually play. Take up the whole width of this container here. And as you can see here, we have a hint. It says, guess what you need to do if you want the flex child to span across full width of its parent container. Right, just set its width to 100%. And this is exactly what we're going to do. So I'm going to select number 3, and I'm going to change the width to 100%. Nice. Then I'm going to change the order to first. Now what I need to do is select the parent and change the align option here. Okay, so I'm going to change the align to align rows start. And
ऐसे भी कर सकते हैं। चलो कुछ सीख लिया अपन ने नया। 100% इतना सा क्यों आ रहा है इसमें? इसमें ये कर सकता हूँ कि उसकी प्रॉपर्टी अलग बना दूँ, लेकिन वैसा क्यों करूँगा मैं? रैप करना था। ऑरेंज वाले को कैसे लाऊं?
it's done. Let's move on to the next one. There is no hint this time. That's totally fine. Let's see what we have. All right, so first, the second circle should be placed here instead of this green circle. Therefore, I'm going to select this. I'm going to change its order to first. All right, then number one should take up the whole width of this green placeholder. Therefore, I'm going to change its width to 100%. And as you can see, since we didn't change its children to wrap, everything is messed up here. So I'm going to change the children to wrap. All right, we're getting there. And let's see what we have. First, I'm going to select this circle 3 and change the sizing to grow if possible. Nice. And the only thing left is the alignment. So I'm going to select the parent and change the alignment here to space between. All right, done. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, hint, the align setting on individual flex children will help you. All right, cool. First, this circle 1 should be last since it's going to be placed at the bottom. So I'm going to change its order to last. So the order is correct now. Then I'm going to select circle 1 and set its width to 100%. Nice. Finally, I'm going to select the parent and change it to wrap. I'm going to select circle 1, this one, and change its alignment to bottom. I'm going to select the parent once again, and let's see how can we align these two circles. If I change the justify to the right, number 2 will be placed properly, and now I need to change the alignment of this particular circle. Number 3, I need to select it, and let's change its alignment to bottom. Nice. Level 26 is done as well. Let's move on.
Okay, okay. So
to level. I'm going to select this circle 3 and change the sizing to circle should be placed here. And so I'm going to select it. All right, cool. First, this circle 1 to bottom. I'm going to select the parent once again and 100%. Nice. Finally, I'm going to select the parent and change it to wrap. I'm going to select circle 1, this one, and change its alignment to bottom. I'm going to
ये हो गया फर्स्ट. गड़बड़ कर दी, वापस करना पड़ेगा। नहीं ना, नहीं एक्चुअली आई गेस, क्योंकि इसको मैं कर दूंगा
select the parent once again, and let's see if it will grow, but the order is right. Let's see what we have. Here we have 1, 4, 5. So I'm going to select the parent and reverse the direction first, just like that, since 1 is here. Then I'm going to select the second circle. Solve some of these challenges, that's totally fine, because in real world projects, we never use some of these layouts, okay? But it's good for... Now that you've learned about Flexbox and Grid, it's time to compare them side by side to see which one you should use for which purpose. Well, let me mention that sometimes there is no right or wrong way when it comes to web development, because you can achieve something using Grid and you may achieve the same thing using a Flexbox. So sometimes it all comes to our preferences and how we want to structure our website. Therefore, I'm going to show you some examples to understand the difference better. First of all, you need to know that when we have one-dimensional layouts, it's probably best to use a Flexbox. But sometimes if we want to make our design responsive and make our...
क्या हो गया ये? नहीं,
we want to make our design responsive and make our life much easier, we can do the same thing using a grid. So here I have a card inside this section. I'm going to go ahead and add a container here. I'm going to drag and drop a container, and then let me add the class container to that. And finally, I'm going to drag and drop this card into my container. Nice. Now I'm going to copy it and paste it 3 times. Okay. All right. Let me select my section since I turned it to a Flexbox, and now I'm going to select my container and I'm going to change the display setting to Flexbox. And here we have a horizontal Flexbox. And as you can see, everything looks great. I can change the justification to space between, to space around, left, middle, whatever I want. But now I'm using a one-dimensional layout. If I have 2 containers like this, okay, this section, I'm going to go ahead and add a container here. I'm going when it comes to web development, because you can achieve something using grid and you may achieve the same thing using our preferences and how we want to structure. To know that when we have one-dimensional layouts, it's probably best to use a Flexbox. But sometimes if we want to make our design responsive and make our life much easier, we can do the same thing using a grid. So here I have a card inside this section. I'm going to go ahead and add a container here. I'm going to drag and drop a container, and then let me add the class container to that. And finally, I'm going to drag and drop this card into my container. Nice. Now I'm going to copy it and paste it 3 times. Okay. All right. Let me select my section since I turned it to a Flexbox, and now I'm going to select my container and I'm going to change the display setting to Flexbox. And here we have a horizontal Flexbox. And as you can see, everything looks great. I can change the justification to space between, to space around, left, middle, whatever I want. But now I'm using a one-dimensional layout. If I have 2 containers like this, okay, now we have a 2-dimensional layout, it probably makes more sense to use a grid. So now let's check this layout on different breakpoints. I'm going to go to tablet. As you can see, it shrinks. Okay, nice. However, if you want to make our design more responsive, it would make sense to use a grid as well, even for one-dimensional layout. It's totally up to you, okay? As I mentioned before, there is no right or wrong way. Sometimes we just need to focus on our preferences and focus on the fact that which way suits our needs better. Now let me go ahead and drag and drop a grid here. I'm going to put it inside my section, and let me drag these cards inside this grid. Of course, I could turn this container to a grid, but I'm going to do this manually, just like this. I'm going to remove the container, and now we have this grid which is inside our section. Oops. I'm going to copy and paste this card once again. Let me select this grid, and I'm going to add a class to it. I'm going to call it grid. Then let me add some margin from both sides. Alright, cool. Just like a flexbox, we can control the child of a grid as well. So here, if I select this child, this card, I can modify the alignment, I can change the justify here, I can change the order, and so on. So it comes to you to decide whether you need to use a grid or
Grid
flexbox.
best.
Okay, make sure to work with both of them and check which one makes more sense to use for your needs. Alright, guys. Here I have a card, but it doesn't look good. Why? Because of the spacing. Here the content cannot breathe. Therefore, I need to modify the spacing between these elements. As I mentioned before, when it comes to spacing, we have two main components. We have the margin and the padding. The margin is the space outside the element, and the padding is the space inside an element. So let's take a look. Here, I'm going to select my card. And if I want to add some breathing room for this text block here, I'm going to select that, and I can add left padding and right padding, just like that. Alternatively, what I can do is select the card and select that, and I can add left padding and right padding, just like that. Padding. The margin is the space outside the element, and the padding is the space inside an element. So let's take a look. Here, I'm going to select my card. And if I want to add some breathing room for this text block here, I'm going to select that, and I can add left padding and right padding, just like that. Alternatively, what I can do is select the card and add the padding. However, this padding applies to all the elements inside this card, to all the children of this card div block. So let's give it a try. Just like that, and there we go. But this is not what I want. So I'm going to undo the process, and I'm going to select the text block, and I'm going to add 20 pixels left and right padding. However, it's very tedious and time consuming to add the padding for each side one by one. Therefore, I can hold down the Option key on macOS and Alt key on Windows, and then click and drag to adjust the padding for opposing sides, just like that. If I want to change the padding for all sides, like top, bottom, left, and right, instead of Option or Alt key, I need to hold down the Shift key on my keyboard and then click and drag. Check it out. That saves a lot of time. But what about the margin? Let me set the top padding here to 0, and I'm going to select this heading. This time, instead of padding, I'm going to change the margin, the bottom margin. As I mentioned before, the margin is the space outside of an element. Therefore, I'm going to increase that by 10 pixels, and the top margin by 10 pixels as well. Alright, it looks much better now. Alright, now this card is inside a container. If I take it outside this container for a second, we can see that it touches the edges, okay? And if I want to align it to the center of my section, let me remove this container for a second. If I want to center it both horizontally and vertically, I have some options. The first option is that I can go ahead and set the margin manually, just like this, which is not a good option, and you shouldn't try that ever. The reason is, when you set the margin manually, it may look good on one device. However, if you go to the iPad breakpoint, we can see that it's not centered because it still has a 435 pixel margin. So you should never do that. Alright, I'm going to reset this margin. I'm going to click on that, and let's click on reset. Alternatively, you can hold down the Option or Alt key and then click on that, just like this. Alright, so how can I align it to the center? I have different options. Whenever you have an element that has a fixed width, like this, when the width is defined here, as you can see here, the width is 300 pixels, you can set the left and right margin to auto. If I click on that, I can set the left margin to auto, and then I'm going to set the right margin to auto as well, and there we go. Now it's centered perfectly. Let's give it a try. I'm going to check if it's responsive, and if it works properly, I'm going to go to tablet. As you can see, it's still in the middle. That's perfect. Alright, this is one option, okay? Let me reset. These margins, you could just click on this button right here. Now both left and right margins are set to auto. However, keep in mind that this way only works when you have a defined width. Okay, let me reset these margins. You could just set the right margin to auto as well, and there we go. Now it's centered perfectly. Let's give it a try. I'm going to check if it's responsive, and if it works properly, I'm going to go to tablet. As you can see, it's still in the middle. That's perfect. Alright, this is one option, okay? Let me reset these margins. You could just click on this button right here. Now both left and right margins are set to auto. However, keep in mind that this way only works when you have a defined width. If not, you can use another way, and that is flexbox. Alright, let me reset these margins. Now I have this card, and I'm going to select the section, and the display setting is set to block. I'm going to set it to flex. I'm going to align it to the center and justify it to the center. There we go. We've got the same thing. But this option works even if your element doesn't have a defined width. Alright, now I'm going to show you another example. First, I'm going to select this card, and as you can see, its display setting is set to block. Okay, I'm going to change it to flex for a second, and everything is disorganized because the direction is set to horizontal. I'm going to change it to vertical. Alright, we are good again. And now I'm going to change the alignment to center. Let me select the image now. Let me change its width to 200 pixels and its height to 200 pixels as well. Sometimes we might need to move this image up in order to have an overlay image. Okay, to do that we can use negative space. Let me show you how it works. I'm going to select this image, and here in the margin I'm going to give it a negative margin. Okay, just like that. There we go. Using negative margins is totally left and right margins are set to width. Alright, now I'm going to show you another example. First, I'm going to select this card, and as you can see, its display setting is set to block. Okay, I'm going to change it to flex for a second, and everything is disorganized because the direction is set to horizontal. I'm going to change it to vertical. Alright, we are good again. And now I'm going to change the alignment to center. Let me select the image now. Let me change its width to 200 pixels and its height to 200 pixels as well. Sometimes we might need to move this image up in order to have an overlay. Good again. And now I'm going to change the alignment to center. Let me select the image now. Let me change its width to 200 pixels and its height to 200 pixels as well. Sometimes we might need to move this image up in order to have an overlay image. Okay, to do that we can use negative space. Let me show you how it works. I'm going to select this image, and here in the margin I'm going to give it a negative margin. Okay, just like that. There we go. Using negative margins is totally fine. In fact, many popular websites use them. Alright guys, that's all about spacing. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you in the next video. In web development, there are different size units that we can use, and in this video, we're going to talk about every single one of them. So let's get started. First of all, I'm going to go ahead and drag and drop an image into my canvas. Let me drop it inside my section here. For images, you can specify the dimensions right here in the image settings, but it's not a good way. Why? Let me show you. Here, I'm going to change the width to 400 pixels, and the height is going to be auto, okay? For now, it looks fine. But if I go to the desktop breakpoint, and if I want to make some changes specifically for this dimension, the changes apply to the desktop version as well. In web development, there are different
भाई बहुत बड़ा कोर्स है भाई यार फिट रही हेलो अरे क्या कर रहा है तू भाई कुछ टपरी से ले आएगा मतलब कैंटीन खुल गई क्या तो क्या टाइम हुआ अभी हाँ तो मतलब मेरे को चिप्स वगैरह चाहिए थे मैं मतलब अभी वो वेबसाइट ही बना रहा हूँ स्ट्रीम करके तो मतलब फ्री है तो लिया ये बोल रहा था फ्री हाँ मैं कह रहा हूँ कि अरे मैं वो बना रहा था मतलब वेबसाइट ही बना रहा था तो देख ले फ्री है तो लिया हाँ मर्जी है तेरी कभी भी लिया हाँ चिप्स वगैरह मतलब मेरे अर्जेंट लिया है मतलब 100-200 की हाँ मतलब एक दो लीज वाले लिए और बाकी मतलब वही है छोटे मोटे जो भी हो हज़ारी तड़के वो जो तू खाता है वो सब ले हो हाँ पैक चाहिए और बनवा के अब कैंटीन तो खुलेगी तो 3 बजे खोलेंगे तो बेंचो टाइम लगेंगे अभी तो 3:30-4 बजे तक देंगे बनाने वाला तो मर्जी है तेरी अभी तेरे अभी लाना तो अभी लिया नहीं तो देख ले चल ठीक उल्लू बना दिया
different size units that we can use. And in this video, we're going to talk about every single one of them. So let's get started. First of all, I'm going to go ahead and drag and drop an image into my canvas. Let me drop it inside my section here. For images, you can specify the dimensions right here in the image settings, but it's not a good way. Why? Let me show you. Here, I'm going to change the width to 400 pixels, and the height is going to be auto, okay? For now, it looks fine. But if I go to the desktop breakpoint, and if I want to make some changes specifically for this dimension, the changes apply to the desktop version as well. Let me show you. I'm going to double click on it, and I'm going to decrease the width here to 300 pixels. And if I go back to the desktop breakpoint, there we go. Our image is resized. And this is not good when we want to design responsive web pages. Therefore, it's always good to use classes in order to size your images. So you should avoid sizing your images here as much as you can. I'm going to set it to auto. All right, great. Now on the right side, you can see that in the side panel, we have the size section. As I mentioned before, these are all CSS properties, and the size is also a CSS property. And we have different units to work with. The simplest one is pixel. Any element's dimensions by default are set to auto. Okay, as you can see, it says auto. And auto determines the dimensions of that element in respect to the parent of that element. In this case, the parent of this image is this section. And here the width and height are set to auto. So I'm going to select this image, and instead of auto, I'm going to give it a specific value, okay? Let's say 350 pixels. To write the unit, you can just simply write PX, or you could just click on this little PX here and you will see all the available units. I'm going to select PX. Let me make it larger. I'm going to set it to 450 pixels. Now this image has a specific width. We can set a specific height for that as well. Let's set it to 350 pixels, just like that. But what about other units? We have percentage. I'm going to choose that. Well, percentage is actually relative to the parent element as well. So for instance, if I want this image to take up 30% of the available space here in this section, which is the parent element, I can select it and I can set it to 30%. And keep in mind that the percentage actually takes up the available space. So here for this section, right now I have a 40 pixel left and right padding. Therefore, it takes up 30% of the left space here. Okay, let me select my image. I can simply set it to 50% or whatever amount I want. The same thing happens to height. If I move this image out of my section here, and the parent of this image now is the body, so it takes up 50% of the browser window. Let's check it out. If I preview that, as you can see, it takes up 50% of my browser window. If I just modify the dimension, you can see that it still takes up 50% of the dimension. It's easy, isn't it? All right, now let's move on to the next unit. The next unit is M. We're going to talk about M's and Rems, although they are not that useful. Let's start with M's. Actually, M's and Rems are relative to the font size. So here, the font size is set to 14 pixels. And hold down the Option key on my keyboard or Alt key if you're using Windows and just click and drag. You can just fix this problem. First, I'm going to set the size to 16 pixels. All right. And now here for the padding, I'm going to use M's for the top, bottom.
अरे नहीं सीखना है
If you increase the font size, nothing happens because RAM doesn't respect the font size here. Let's give it a try. Nothing happens. What do I mean by that? Let me set this width to, let's say, 50 ch. It means the width of this paragraph is now set to 50 zeros of this particular font. Let me show you how it works. I'm going to write something here. Let me make this font size larger. I'm going to set it to 20, and let's write hello, and then I'm going to change the width to 10 ch. 10 ch doesn't mean 10 characters. This is a very common mistake that most beginners make. This is not about characters. Let me prove that to you. Here I'm going to write hello, and again I'm going to write hello, and once again let's write hello. Only HE here. Let's count it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. It's 12 characters. But if I hit enter and I try to write zeros, we should be able to write precisely 10 zeros. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. The next zero goes to the next line. So this is how the CH works. If I change the font here to something else, you can see that the width changes as well. Can you see that? All right, now let's move on to the next unit, which is VW and VH. Well, VW stands for viewport width and VH stands for viewport height. So what do they mean? Well, I'm gonna select this image and I'm gonna set the width to 50 VW. What does it mean? Viewport is actually the size of our browser window. If I use a 13-inch screen, my viewport is a 13-inch. If I use a larger screen, my viewport will be larger, okay? So if I set the width to 50 hard, okay? And if I select that, you can see that the width and height are set to auto. However, it doesn't look good. Why? Because it takes up the whole width of the section, its parent element. How can I fix that? Well, instead of setting a specific width for that, I'm gonna set a minimum width and a maximum width for that. Let's say we want this. If I want to limit the maximum width of this image or this card, let's say, I need to modify the maximum width. So here, the maximum width is going to be 400 pixels. And there we go. Now, this card is 400 pixels, but it can't be smaller than 350 pixels. So let's give it a try. So if I preview that, you can see that it can't be smaller than 350 pixels, okay? Because we set a minimum width for that. If I make it smaller, for example, the minimum width is going to be, let's say, 250 pixels. Now, it can be smaller, okay? Just like that. So this is minimum width. We can use minimum height as well. It functions exactly the same. We can use that for our hero section, for example, for our sections. We can set the minimum height to, let's say, 100 VH, and it means that it takes up at least 100% of the viewport height, and it doesn't mess up with our content. As I mentioned, these units are advanced, and if you don't know how they work completely, that's totally fine because it takes time and practice to completely get used to these units. Now let's move on to the next topic, which is overflow. So here in our card, I have a paragraph. All right, I'm going to reset this minimum width and minimum height, and here I'm going to set a specific width, like 340 pixels. Instead of auto, I'm going to set it to, let's say, 400 pixels, okay? And now if I try to add more sentences here, let's see what happens. There we go. Now we have the overflow. It happens sometimes, and we can fix that. To fix that, we need to select the parent of this element. The parent of this text block is this card. Make sure to select the parent, and if you head over to the overflow, here we can set the overflow to hidden. It kind of masks the overflowing content. If I preview that, make sure to select the parent, and if you head over to the overflow, here we can set the overflow to hidden. It kind of masks the overflowing content. If I preview that, you can see that there is no overflow happening. We have other options as well. We have scroll. If I select that, you can see that the user can scroll through the content, just like that. We have one more option, and that is auto. Auto means that the browser first checks if there is so much content here that doesn't fit into this card, it will show the scroll, okay? But if I try to remove some sentences here, like this, it will not show the scroll. All right, now we need to talk about the last property of the size section, which is fit. Let me drag and drop a div block here. There we go. I'm going to give it a class. Let's call it demo. And for this demo, I'm going to go ahead and drag and drop an image here. So let's suppose that we want this image to cover this div block. So first, I'm going to select this image. I'm going to set the width and height to 100%. It means that it takes 100% of its parent width, which is this demo div block, and 100% of its parent height, which is exactly this demo div block, okay? Then while this image is selected, I'm going to change the fit from fill to cover. Now let's see what happens. If I select this demo div block, I can get a specific width and height, like 400 pixels, and you can see that the image covers this div block perfectly. If I modify the height, let's say to 500 pixels, there we go, it covers the image, and it doesn't change the aspect ratio of the image since we set the fit to cover. If I change it to, let's say fill, it will change the aspect ratio. But since it's set to cover, it doesn't change the aspect ratio of our image. But what if you are not satisfied with the positioning of this image? Well, there is an advanced option. Right next to this fit, if you select your image, you can click on this 3-dot icon, and then you can position your image however you want. Alright guys, that's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you didn't understand some of those advanced units, that's Hey, in this video, we're going to talk about positioning. Basically, we have 6 different kinds of positioning. We have static, we have relative, we have absolute, fixed, sticky, and finally we have float. So in this video, we're going to dive into each of them, and I'm going to show you how they differ from each other and how you can use them properly. Are you ready? Let's begin. I'm going to start with static. Any element by default has a static position. What does that mean? It means that they are part of the document flow, so they take up space on our page, and also they appear in the order that they are stacked. So for example, here I have a heading, its position is set to static, then I have a paragraph, again static, then I have this image wrapper, again static, then I have these images, these div blocks. Video, we're going to talk about positioning. Basically, we have 6 different kinds of positioning. We have static, we have relative, we have absolute, fixed, sticky, and finally we have float. So in this video, we're going to dive into each of them, and I'm going to show you how they differ from each other and how you can use them properly. Are you ready? Let's begin. I'm going to start with static. Any element by default has a static position. What does that mean? It means that they are part of the document flow, so they take up space on our page, and also they appear in the order that they are stacked. So for example, here I have a heading, its position is set to static, then I have a paragraph, again static, then I have this image wrapper, again static, then I have these images, these div blocks, they are all set to static, okay? Most of the time we use the position static, and we change the positioning using the display settings that we talked about before. But sometimes, for some specific reasons, we might need to change the positioning. So let's see how they differ from each other. I'm going to select this image, the third one, this div block, and I'm going to change its position from static to relative. Let's see what happens. Nothing. But it's not true, because now its position is relative to itself. Here, as you can see, it says relative to, and then it indicates that the position of this div block is relative to itself. What does it mean? When we set the position of any element to relative, we have 2 positions, the old position and the new position. The new position of this element is relative to the old position of this element. It sounds complicated and complex at first glance, but believe me, it's so simple. Let me show you. Here, once I set this position to relative, I have access to these positioning settings. If I try to change its position, just like that, now this new position is relative to its previous position. So we moved it by 92 pixels to the left from its original position. And when we set the position of an element to relative, it's still part of the document flow. So it still takes up space. So this is basically how the relative positioning works. One thing to mention is that when we have different elements that we want to put on top of each other, we can't do that using static. Let me show you what I mean. If I set it to static, and if I want these images to overlap each other, I can't do that. Of course, I can change the padding and margin, and I can give them some negative margin and padding. However, that's not a good way. Why? Because when we change the margin and padding, we are actually changing the actual position of that element, and we are changing the document flow. This is not what we want. If we want these images to overlap each other for a specific layout, we can set these elements to relative, okay? If I select this div block, the last one, and I set its position to relative, it's relative to itself, and here we have a new property which is called z-index, okay? So the z-index lets us control how our elements should stack on top of each other. So if I want the second image to appear on top of this image, I can select it, I can set it to relative, and as soon as I set it to relative, I can change its z-index, okay? So let's set it to 1. There we go. Now this image has a higher z-index, therefore it will be on top of our previous image. If I select this first image and I set its position to relative, I can move it to the right side, just like that, and it's behind our middle image. Why? Because our middle image, the second image, has a higher z-index. If I want this first image to be on top of our middle image, I can set a higher z-index for that, for example 2. There we go. If I want the third one to be on top of all these images, I can set its z-index to 3. And if I move it around, you can clearly see that it's on top of the other 2 images. So this is basically how the relative positioning works. We create a new position for our element, which is relative to its old position. And we can also control the z-index. Alright, now let's set the position of these images back to static for a second. Okay, so let's talk about the other positioning option, which is absolute. If I set an element to position absolute, let's see what happens. As you can see, everything is disorganized, okay? I can get access to these alignment options, and if I click on that, for example, top left, you can see that it will be positioned to the top left. And here it says that it's relative to body. The position absolute works like this. It always looks for the first parent element that has the positioning of relative, okay? So here I have this image wrapper, and this image wrapper has a static positioning. Therefore, when I change the position of this div block, this image to absolute, it's relative to body, okay? So what if I want this image to be relative to this image wrapper? Well, it's simple. I can select the image wrapper, and I can change its position to relative. There we go. Now this image is relative to the image wrapper boundary, okay? Now it founds a parent element, which is this image wrapper that has a relative positioning. You need to understand and learn these concepts very well, because when it comes to web development, these positioning options could really help you to create some stunning layouts and some stunning web pages. All right, now I can select this div block, and I can modify its position however I want, and it's now relative to its parent, which has the relative positioning. So when can we use the absolute positioning? For example, let's suppose you want to create a pop-up window, which is so popular, and nowadays most websites use a pop-up to let the user register for something, okay? So in that case, we can use the position absolute. Of course, we will talk about the position absolute and different use cases later on, but for now, you just need to understand how it works. And just like the relative, we can still work with the z-index here, okay? One thing to mention about position absolute is that when you set an element to position absolute, it's no longer part of the document flow. What do I mean by that? It means that it doesn't take space. So if I try to move it around, it doesn't take any space here. It's not like relative. This is the main difference between position absolute and relative. So you need to keep that in mind. It doesn't take any space. All right, let's set it to static. Now I'm going to talk about the next positioning option, which is fixed. Let me show you another example. I'm going to go ahead and drag and drop a navigation bar here, and I'm going to put it right below my body. All right, here. Then let's give it a class. I'm going to write nav Cool. And also, I'm gonna modify its height. Let's set its height to something like 200 pixels. It's too much, maybe 150 pixels. All right, cool. I set its height to 150 pixels because I'm gonna show you something in a second. So let's preview our project for a second. This navigation bar is part of the document flow and it takes up space. If I scroll down, you can see that everything works as expected, okay? And it disappears as soon as I scroll down. What if I wanted to stick to the top while I'm scrolling? Well, we can use the fixed option, okay? If I use position fixed, let's see what happens. First, everything will be disorganized because when we set something to fixed, we need to specify its alignment, okay? We need to define that it should be fixed at the top, for example, okay? And now it's fixed. However, this is not part of the document flow anymore. How do I know that? Because now you can see that this container pushed up a little bit. Why? Because there is no navigation bar anymore taking up space. If I preview that, you can see that it sticks to the top, just like that. However, we've got this problem. So to fix that, we can use another positioning. But before doing that, let me show you another example of fixed positioning. If I select this image, this div block, and I set its position to fixed, okay, I can change its alignment to bottom right corner, and it's relative to the body. Actually, it's relative to the viewport. It's not relative to its parents anymore. It's relative to the browser window. So if I preview that, you can see that it's fixed to the bottom right corner. And if I scroll down, it's still fixed there because it's relative to the viewport.
Kishan Kumar.
To the browser window, bottom right corner, and it's relative to the body. Actually, it's relative to the viewport. It's not relative to its parents anymore. It's relative to the browser window. So if I preview that, you can see that it's fixed to the bottom right corner, and if I scroll down, it's still fixed there because it's relative to the viewport, to the browser window. All right. And if I want to change the dimension, let me show you how it works. Just like that, it's still there. Okay. All right. Let me set its position back to static, and I'm gonna show you how we can fix the problem with this navbar. Okay, because we don't want to mess up with our document flow. We can use the sticky option. If I select this navbar and set its position to sticky, you can see that it's still part of the document flow because this container didn't push up. However, we can specify that it should stick to the top. If it's set to auto, if all these edges are set to auto, see what happens. It doesn't work. The thing with sticky is that you need to define where this element should stick to. So I'm going to set the top here to 0. It means that it should stick to the top edge of our browser. And one thing to mention is that sticky is also relative to the viewport. It's not relative to its parent. So now if I preview that, there we go. It sticks to the top and it's not messing with our document flow because it's still part of the document flow. We can use this position for our navigation bar, for the footer. But I prepared another example for you, which is so popular nowadays. Here I have a section, and inside I have a container, which is a flexbox. And inside this container, I have two different div blocks, the content div block on the left side and this newsletter div block on the right side. Okay, nothing complicated. I'm going to select this newsletter div and I'm going to change its position to sticky. Let's see what happens. First, I'm going to go ahead and remove this navbar. Okay, we don't need it anymore. And now I'm going to preview that. As you can see, nothing happens. Why? Because as you remember, when we work with sticky position, we need to specify where it should stick to, okay? So here, I'm going to set the top to 0, and let me show you what happens. I'm going to preview that, and if I scroll down, as soon as it touches the top edge of my browser, which is the top of the viewport, we can see that it starts sticking, just like that, until it reaches the end of its parent element, which is the container. All right, let me show you once again. Since we set the top position to 0, once it touches the top edge, it starts sticking until it reaches the end of its parent element, which is, in this case, the container, okay? And then it behaves normally, as you can see. Now, we can even add more spacing here. For example, I'm going to set it to 100, and let's see what happens. Now, when there is 100 pixels at the top, it starts sticking, just like that. How cool is that? You can see this kind of behavior on many websites like Medium or other different blogging websites. Now let's talk about another option, which is the last type of positioning, and it's called float. Well, nowadays we don't use float and clear that much. However, for some use cases, it's still very practical and we can use float. So let me show you how it works. First of all, I'd like to mention that float and clear don't work with flexboxes and the child of a flexbox. So here I have a container, which is not a flexbox. The display setting is set to block, and inside I have a simple image div block, and then I have a paragraph. If I select this image div block and I change its position to float, for example, float left, you can see that the content wraps around this image now. If I change the float to right, you can see that now the content is wrapping from the left side, okay? Just the opposite side. But what is clear? Let's suppose we have this image set to float left, and I'm going to select this paragraph, and I want it not to wrap around this specific image. In this case, I can set clear to left, right, or both sides. Most of the time we use both sides, okay? Since our image is here on the left side, now only the left side works. If I set it to left, you can see that it's not wrapping around it anymore. But if I set it to right, it doesn't work because our element here, which is set to float, is not on the right side. If I set clear both, you can make sure that it will be cleared. Alright guys, that's all for this video. We talked about a lot of different things, and I hope you could understand different kinds of positioning. Hey, in this video, we're going to talk about the typography section on the style panel on the right side. Here I have some text elements, I have a heading, and also I have a paragraph. So let me select the heading, and I'm going to show you all the properties of the typography panel here. First, we have the font. If you open it up, you have some default fonts. If you want to add more fonts, you can click on this add fonts at the top, and you will take into the project settings. And here under the fonts tab, you can add different fonts. For example, if you want to work with Google fonts, like Roboto or other Google fonts, you can just add them here. Let me look for Roboto for a second. Let me see if I can find it. All right, there we go. Here is Roboto. Then you can select variants of that particular font. These are the weights of your font. For example, regular, 500, 700, which is black. And if you want to upload some custom fonts, fonts, you can upload them here from your computer. And if you want to use Adobe fonts, you can simply use this section to connect your project to Adobe fonts using an API. Okay, now let's talk about the typography panel. So I'm going to select this heading, and here we talked about the font. Then we have weight, we have bold, different weights. Each font has different weights. Then we have size. This is our font size, and you can use different units like the size property here. You can use pixel, percent, ems and rems, ch, viewport width, and viewport height. And finally, we have the line height, which is so important when we have a paragraph. So here, if I select this paragraph, I set the line height to 150%. So it's 150% of the font size. If I just reset this setting, you can see that this paragraph is not that legible. Therefore, it's always a good practice to increase your line height, especially when you're working with small font sizes. So I'm going to set it to 150%. There we go. Here we have color. You can change the color of your font easily to whatever color you want. Here is the hue slider. Then we have the transparency slider. This controls the alpha amount of your color. If you want to, let's say, decrease the opacity, you can just use this slider. Here we have the hex color code. You can just copy and paste the hex color code from any design software you work with, no matter if it's Figma, Sketch, Adobe XD, it doesn't matter. Then we have HSV, which stands for hue, saturation, and brightness. We're not going to talk about these specifications here. Then we have the alpha or the opacity. If I use this slider and I decrease the opacity, you can see that the alpha amount changes. Here we have the contrast ratio, and it actually lets us know whether we have enough contrast between the background color and the foreground color. And as you can see, it says AAA, and it means it's very legible. But if I try to use some lighter colors like that, you can see first we have AA. It's still fine, it's still good. But if it says fail, it means that your text may not be legible to some people. It changes based on your font size and different factors. So always make sure that your color passes the contrast ratio test. Okay. All right. Let me undo the process. All right. So what do we have here? Here is where we can create our swatches. Let's suppose we have this color and we want to create a color style, or let's say a color swatch. If you're familiar with Figma, you may know that we can create color styles, and this works like that. Okay. So here we can just click on this plus button and it creates a new swatch, and I can name it. For example, I can say neutral/light. Create. And if I select any other element here and I head over to the color section, you can see that this swatch is here. And as you can see, there is this little arrow, and it means this is a global swatch, and I can use it for any element, just like that. Here, if I use this neutral light swatch for this paragraph and I use it here as well, for example, let me change that. So if I change it here, if I click on this pen button and I try to change this color, you can see that the changes apply immediately to all the elements that are using this particular swatch. So you need to make sure to keep your colors organized. All right, let's undo the process. Let's move on to the next property, which is align. It's so simple. We have different alignment options: left, center, right, and justify, just like Microsoft Word or any design software. Okay. And we have the style property. We can italicize our text like that. We can use some decorations here. For example, we can use this strike through. We can use underline or overline. Okay. If you want to create some links, for example, we can use this underline. Then we have this more type options. By default, it's not visible, but if you click on that, you can get access to these advanced options such as letter spacing, text indent, columns, and these capitalize and direction options. Okay. So let's go through each of them. Using this field, we can control the letter spacing. For example, if I want to increase the spacing between letters, I can set a higher letter spacing here. I'm going to set it to 20 now. And as you can see now, the spacing between letters is much higher. Let me decrease that. Actually, a good use case for using letter spacing is when we have a word that is completely capitalized. So if I select this interior design and if I set the capitalize option to all caps like that, sometimes if I work with small font sizes, I need to increase the letter spacing to improve legibility and readability of my text. So in this case, let me set it to 5. Now it looks much better. I can set it to 3 as well. So this is used basically for this purpose. Now let's move on to the next one, which is text indent. I'm going to select this paragraph and let me specify an amount like 20 pixels. It just indents the text. Okay, just like Microsoft Word. And then we have columns. Actually, I've never used that, and I rarely see any website or any designer uses this option, but it's good to know that it exists. So if I specify 3 here, it takes our text and it divides it into 3 equal columns. If I hit enter, there we go. Now we have 3 different columns, and we can just modify the gap here, for example, the styling. We can add some dividers. As you can see, we can modify the thickness of that divider, just like that. And also we can modify the color of that divider. Okay, but to be honest, I've never used that, and I doubt you should use that too. All right, let me remove that for now. If you want to reset any property here, you can hold down the Option key or Alt key on your keyboard and then just click on that once, just like that. Okay, then we have the capitalize options. We have all caps, as I showed you before. We have capitalize every word, just like that, or we have lowercase. Okay, I'm gonna set it to none. Then we have direction. For most languages, we use left to right direction, but for some languages like Arabic, you can use right to left direction. Then we have breaking. There are some options like this. It's not that useful, so we're not gonna touch upon all these options since most of the time we don't use this breaking option. Then we have text shadow. If I click on this plus button, I can add shadow to my text, just like that. I highly recommend you should avoid adding shadows to your text because it decreases the legibility of your text. Okay, so I'm gonna remove this. All right, that's all about typography. But there is one more thing I'm gonna mention here. If I go ahead and drag and drop a div block here, I'm gonna give it a class. So let's write typography. Okay, and here for this div block, I can set some specific properties that its children can use. So if I change the font to something else, let's use this one for instance, and I increase the font size to, let's say, 40 pixels, something dramatic, and also I change the color to red, you can see that nothing happens here because there is no text layer inside. However, if I go ahead and drag and drop a heading here, there we go. Now this heading is getting the properties from the default properties we set to its parent, which is this typography div block. Of course, we can override it. For example, we can give a class to this heading like heading 1 and just modify the color to whatever we want and font size or any other properties here. But you need to understand that sometimes it makes much more sense to add the default properties to the parent of our elements first, and then we can just simply drag and drop those elements and we don't need to modify everything from scratch. For example, you can select your section. If your section is going to have some specific fonts and let's say some specific font properties, you can just specify those properties for the section, and then whatever you put inside this section will inherit from the properties that you set for that section. So I personally, when I want to start a project, I select my body and I set the font here once, and then I don't need to change the font again and again and again. Of course. Hey, in this video we're going to talk about backgrounds. If you head over to the style panel, right under the typography section, we have the background section, and it's very useful because we are going to use it almost all the time. So here, as you can see, I have two different sections. One empty section, this is for the next part of this video, but for the first part, we're going to work with this section. Inside I have a container as usual, and then I have a heading and a paragraph. Let's suppose we want to add a background to our section. So I'm going to select my section, and I can go to the backgrounds, and I can click on this plus button here, and now I can choose image. I already showed you this section, but we didn't actually dive into all the details here. Okay, now I'm going to choose this image from my assets, and there we go. By default, it's always set to tile. As you can see here, we have the tile option, and we can just set it to none because we don't want it to tile. And then we have the position options and all these options here. So let's start with the type. Here we have different types. We have image, we have linear gradient, we have radial gradient, and we have the color overlay. So let's first talk about image. Here I can set the size. I can set a custom size if the custom tab is selected. We rarely use this custom size here because we usually size our images using the size property in the style panel. Then we have the cover, which is so useful. Almost all the time we use this option. And we have the contain. Okay, the contain actually scales down the image until it's contained in our section or our container or whatever element it's in. Then I can modify the position here to center. And I'm going to set it to cover for now. All right, our background image looks great. You can also set the left and top position based on percentage. As you can see, by default it's set to 50%. If I set it to top left, you can see that left and top are set to 0. If I want to manually modify them, I can do that as well. I can set it to 48%, for example, or maybe let's say 35%. Okay, nothing changes here because our image is too large actually. So let me modify the top as well to 20%. As you can see, it moves down. All right, I'm going to undo the process. If we want our image to tile, we can use the tile option, and we can just set a custom width. Let me set a custom width that you can see how it works. I'm going to set the width to 100 pixels, and as you can see, since the tile option has been selected, our image is tiled. I can set it to horizontally tile and also vertically tile. All right, I'm going to set it to don't tile, and let's set it to cover. We have the fixed option here. By default, all images are set to not fixed. We're going to talk about the difference between fixed and not fixed in a few seconds. But for now, let's move on to the next feature of this image and gradient section. As you can see, our text layers are not readable. Why? Because we don't have enough contrast here. So what if I change their color to white? Let's see if it makes a difference. Of course, it makes a difference, but still, since we have a small font size, sometimes it could be hard to read this text. How can we fix that? Well, a very well-known solution is to just add an overlay, okay? If I select this section here, and then I go to the backgrounds, if I click on this plus button here, I can set the type to overlay, like this, and it creates an overlay, a dark overlay, and we can just control the opacity of this overlay from here, just like that. Now it's much more visible. But what about linear and radial gradients? Let's talk about them as well. I'm going to start with linear gradient. Well, as you know, a gradient is a smooth transition from one color to another color. And by default, we have two different stops or points here, okay? We have the black and white points. I'm going to select this point, and from this color, I'm going to change the color to something else. Let me change it to, for example, this orange. And the next one, I'm going to select the next point, and I'm going to change it to this color. All right. And then I can modify the angle of this gradient here. As you can see, I can simply modify the angle to degree. But what about this repeat option? If I check this checkbox, well, nothing happens. That's because in order for this option to work, we need some space here in the slider. If I just take one of these points and move it to the left side, you can see that now we have more space. And as you can see, it repeats again and again and again, just like that. Okay, I can change the angle as well. Cool. All right, let me just uncheck this repeat option. We're not going to need that. We can also control the opacity of these colors, for example, to create a custom overlay. If I modify the alpha amount here to 50%, as you can see, now we have a gradient overlay. I can do the same thing for my orange color. 50%, there we go, that looks great. But what about radial gradient? If I click on that, and if I set the opacity to 100% again, you could simply see the difference between a linear gradient and a radial gradient. All right, as you can see here, we have a focal point. We can change the size of these images or gradients. You can simply click on this eye icon, or you can just click on this remove button. If you want to reorder your elements here, you can simply hover over these vertical lines that is next to this tiny thumbnail, click and drag, just like that. All right, let me remove this radial gradient for now. But sometimes we just need to have a solid background color. We can do that as well. We can always select an element, no matter if it's a div block, a heading, a paragraph, any box can have a background color. By default, it's set to transparent. If I select it, I can set it to white, for example, but since we have an image here, you can see that I can change the background's color to black, to whatever color I want. Okay, there's also a good trick here. If you want to use some famous colors like white or black, you can simply write its name here. For example, I'm going to write white here, and there we go. I have a white background. If I change it to black, it works. If I change it to red, it works also. But most of the time, we usually manually set the background color, or we copy and paste the hex color code here. Okay, now I'm going to talk about clipping. It works like masking in design software. So let's suppose I want to add a gradient to this heading. Is it possible? No, except it is. If I go to color, I can set a gradient. However, there is a good trick here. If I go to backgrounds here, I can create a gradient here, and I can change the type to linear. And from here, I'm going to change the gradient to, let's say, this color. All right, let me create a cool gradient. All right, nice. Now I'm going to change the angle. However, as you can see, this box doesn't fill this text, okay? It doesn't cover its height. Therefore, I need to increase the height size to something else. Let me increase it to 100 pixels for now. All right, but does it look good? It's not exactly what I want. Well, wait a second. I'm going to go to the backgrounds. And from here, I'm going to go to clipping. And by default, it's set to none. If I change this to clip background to text, there we go. Now we have the gradient clipped inside our text. How cool is that? This is the exact same method that most popular websites use in order to create such an effect. For example, Apple uses this technique as well. So I can simply modify the gradient and the changes applied to this text in real time. Let's see if it works. Yes, it does. I'm going to change the background color of this section to black that you could see the effect much better. All right, now let's talk about the other feature. As you remember, I mentioned that there is another section here. Let me change the background color to white. And here, inside this container, I'm going to drag and drop a div block. And for this div block, I'm going to create a class. Let's call it image fix. Okay?
So इसमें दो चीज़ आ गई ना काम की. एक तो ये टेक्स्ट gradient with clipping, और दूसरा था वो क्या नाम था उसका, पोजीशनिंग में था ना, स्टिकी.
Then I'm going to set its width to 100% so that it takes up the whole width of its parent, which is the container, and the height is going to be 50%. I'm going to go to backgrounds, and from here I'm going to add an image or gradient, and I'm going to choose an image here. There we go. And finally, I'm going to change the size to cover and the position to center. And let's set the tile to none. As you remember, I told you that we're going to talk about the fix option. So let's see by default how it functions. If I preview this web page, it works like that. Okay? As expected. But what if I want this background to be fixed and we create a parallel? This is the exact same method that's more right, and here it's up the whole width of image or gradient. Height is going to be 50%, like that. I'm going to go to backgrounds, and from here I'm going to add an image or gradient and background's color to white. And here inside this container I'm going to drag and drop a div block, and for this div block I'm going to create a class. Let's call it image fix. Okay, then I'm going to set its width to 100% so that it takes up the whole width of its parent, which is the container, and the height is going to be 50%, like that. I'm going to go to backgrounds, and from here I'm going to add an image or gradient, and I'm going to choose an image here. There we go. And finally, I'm going to change the size to cover and the position to center. And let's set the tile to none. As you remember, I told you that we're going to talk about the fix option. So let's see by default how it functions. If I preview this web page, it works like that. Okay? As expected. But what if I want this background to be fixed and we create a parallax effect here? In that case, I can select this image and I can just go to the image settings here. And instead of setting the fix option to not fixed, I'm going to choose fixed. Okay? Once again, I can reposition it however I want. And then let's preview that. There we go. Can you see how cool this effect is? So when we set the image to fixed, it actually creates a new layer behind our browser window. And that new layer is our background image, which is fixed. And we can simply scroll through our page.
Damn भाई,
I'm
इतना
going to change
easy
the background
bench
color
हो.
of this section to black that you could see the effect much better. Alright, now I'm going to go to backgrounds. And here I'm going to add an image or gradient, and I'm going to choose an image here. There we go. And finally, I'm going to change the size to cover and the position to center. And let's set the tile to none. As you remember, I told you that we're going to talk about the fix option. So let's see by default how it functions. If I preview this web page, it works like that. Okay? As expected. But what if I want this background to be fixed and we create a parallax effect here? In that case, I can select this image and I can just go to the image settings here. And instead of setting the fix option to not fixed, I'm going to choose fixed. Okay? Once again, I can reposition it however I want. And then let's preview that. There we go. Can you see how cool this effect is? So when we set the image to fixed, it actually creates a new layer behind our browser window. And that new layer is our background image, which is fixed. And we can simply scroll through our page. We can do the same thing with text as well. Let me prove that to you. Let me remove this image, and I'm going to select this container and add a heading here. Then I'm going to increase the font size dramatically. Let's increase it to 80 pixels or maybe 120 pixels that you could see the effect clearly. Then I'm going to increase the height to 100 pixels or maybe even more, maybe 140 pixels. I'm going to go to image and gradient, and let's add an image here. I'm going to choose, let's say this one, and let's reposition that, do not tile, and cover. All right. How can I do that? Well, first, I need to set the image to fixed. Okay. And then I need to go to clipping, and I'm going to change it to clip background to text. And let's see what happens. Can you see that? Now we have that fixed background sitting behind our text layer. It's very cool. You can create some cool effects with this technique. Now I'm going to talk about something very interesting. So far you learned that
तो ये किस में आता है? ये आता है clip background को यहाँ पढ़ना है, and then
you can add a background image here. If you select your section, you can just add a background image and everything looks perfect. But what if you want to actually add that? I'm going to go to backgrounds, and from here I'm going to add an image or gradient, and I'm going to choose an image here. There we go. And finally, I'm going to change the size to cover and the position to center. And let's set the tile to none. As you remember, I told you that we're going to talk about the fix option. So let's see by default how it functions. If I preview this web page, it works like that. Okay? As expected. But what if I want this background to be fixed and we create a parallax effect here? In that case, I can select this image and I can just go to the image settings here and instead of setting fixed option to not fixed, I'm going to choose fixed, okay? Once again, I can reposition it however I want, and then let's preview that. There we go. Can you see how cool this effect is? So when we set the image to fixed, it actually creates a new layer behind our browser window, and that new layer is our background image, which is fixed, and we can simply scroll through our page. We can do the same thing with text as well. Let me prove the 120 pixels that you could see the effect clearly. Then I'm going to increase the height to 100 pixels or maybe even more, maybe 140 pixels. I'm going to go to image and gradient and let's add an image here. I'm going to choose, let's say this one, and let's reposition that, do not tile and cover. All right, how can I do that? Well, first I need to set the image to fixed, okay? And then I need to go to clipping and I'm going to change it to clip background to text. And let's see what happens. Can you see that? Now we have that fixed background sitting behind our text layer. It's very cool. You can create some cool effects with this technique. Instead of setting the fixed option to not fixed, I'm going to choose fixed, okay? Once again, I can reposition it however I want, and then let's preview that. There we go. Can you see how cool this effect is? So when we set the image to fixed, it actually creates
सेव कर लेता हूँ मैं, लाइट चली जाएगी, माँ चल जाएगी.
a new layer behind our browser window. This one, and let's technique. Now I'm going to talk about something very interesting. So far, you learned that you can add a background image here. If you select your section, you can just add a background image and everything looks perfect. But what if you want to actually add a video to your background? Is it possible? Of course it is. However, we can't do it in the background. We need to use a component, which is called background video. If I go to the add section, and I scroll down, you can see that under the components, I have the background video component. Let me drag and drop it and put it right above my first section. There we go. This is just an element like any other elements, and you can simply modify everything you want. I can give it a specific height, like 100 VH, and then I can use this upload video button to upload a video. So let me go ahead and quickly upload a video. You need to keep in mind that your video should be less than 30 megabytes, okay? And as you can see, nothing happens. That's because the background video component only works when you preview your web page, okay? It doesn't work in the designer. I'm going to preview it, and there it is. Can you see how cool it is? But wait, so let me go ahead and quickly upload a video. You need to keep in mind that your video should be less than 30 megabytes, okay? And as you can see, nothing happens. That's because the background video component only works when you preview your web page, okay? It doesn't work in the designer. I'm going to preview it, and there it is. Can you see how cool it is? But wait, can we add some content on top of this background? Yes, we can. Just like any other elements, I can just select my container here, for example, and bring it and put it inside this background video. But as you can see, it's not centered. So I can select my background video, and I can change the display setting from block to flex. Now let's check it out. Can you see how easy it is to work with these here, for example, and bring it and put it inside this background video? But as you can see, it's not centered. So I can select my background video, and I can change the display setting from block to flex. Now let's check it out. Can you see how easy it is to work with these components? Alright guys, that's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed. 30 megabytes, okay? And as you can see, nothing happens. That's because the can you see how cool it is? Works when you I'm going to wait, can we add some content on top of this background? Yes, we can. Just like any other elements, I can just select my container here, for example, and bring it and put it inside this background video. But as you can see, it's not centered. So I can select my background video, and I can change the display setting from block to flex. Now let's check it out. Can you see how easy it is to work with these components? Alright guys, that's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next video. In this video, we're going to talk about borders. If you scroll down here on the right side, you can see that we have the borders section right under the backgrounds. We use borders almost all the time. It has different properties that we can customize, and we're going to go through all of them. So let's get started. First things first, I'm going to show you a very common example. I'm going to select this button, and as you can see, this button has just a background color. But what if I want to make it rounded? Well, I can head over to the border section, and I can modify the radius property here, okay, to make it rounded. If I increase the corner radius amount, there we go. We've got this cool rounded button. But what if I want to modify the corner radius amount of each corner independently? Well, we can do that as well. If I select this button, and as you can see, this button has just a background color. If I want to make it rounded, well, I can head over to the border section, and I can modify the radius property here, okay, to make it rounded. If I increase the corner radius amount, there we go. We've got this cool rounded button. But what if I want to modify the corner radius amount of each corner independently? Well, we can do that as well. If I click on this option that says individual corners, I can control the corner radius amount amount of each corner separately. One thing to mention is that you can still use all the units we talked about before, like pixel, percentage, m, rem, ch, bw, and vh. Okay, so here, let's suppose I want to just make the two top corner radius rounded. Therefore, I'm going to set the bottom corner's corner radius to 0. Let's see what happens. There we go. We've got this weird looking button now. Let me undo the process. All right, so that's all about corner radius amount. But what if you want to create an outline button instead of a contain button? Right now we have a contain button because it just has a background color. It doesn't have any border. If I want to make an outline button, first I can add a combo class here because I use this button class somewhere else for this register button and this learn more button, and I'm not going to change the default properties. Therefore, I'm going to go ahead and give it a combo class. So let me write contact us, just like that. And then if I head over to the color, this background color, I can write transparent. And our button disappeared, except it didn't. It's still there, but we can't see that. It's not visible because we just set the background color to transparent. If I click on that, you can see that the alpha amount is set to 0. That's why we can't see our element. So the next thing I'm going to do is obviously change the color of my text here to something else. I'm going to change it to black. All right. And then I need to add some borders. If you head over to the borders, here we have the borders section right under the radius, and we can decide whether we want to create borders for all edges or just for specific edges. If you want to create borders for all 4 edges, you need to select this middle one, okay? The one that is in the center. And then you can select your style. I'm going to select solid. All right. We've got our border, but I'm going to increase the width, okay? I can go ahead and manually increase it. For example, I can set an amount here to 3, but if you just want to eyeball and you want to experiment with different amounts, you can hold down the option key on your keyboard or alt key, and then you can click and drag to increase and decrease the width here, just like that. All right, I think 4 pixels looks great. Now you can modify the color of your border as well to whatever color you want, and you can modify the style of your borders like this. That's so simple, isn't it? But let's see what happens if I want to just add borders to some specific edges. I'm going to remove the style, and then I'm going to select a specific edge here, for example left, and then I'm going to set the style to solid, and there we go. One thing to mention is that when your element doesn't have a specific width or height, when you add some borders to that, its size will be changed. However, when you define a specific width and height for your element, it doesn't matter if it's a button or a div block or anything, the dimensions of your element won't change because the border will be added from the inside, not the outside. So let me show you what I mean by that. I'm going to go ahead and select this image, this div block, okay? And this div block has a specific width, not a specific height, okay? And I'm going to go ahead and add some borders here. I'm going to select the middle one, the center, since I'm going to add borders to all 4 edges. And let me select the style solid, all right? And then I'm going to increase the width, just like that. As you can see, the actual dimension of this div block is not changing. And the reason is I have a specific width defined already. But what happens if I remove that? Okay, let's see what happens. I'm going to set it to auto, and then I'm going to move this image outside of this image wrapper for a second to show you how it works. Then let me increase and decrease the width. And as you can see, now the actual dimension is changing, okay? Why? Because there is no width and height defined. If I set a specific width here, for example, 350 pixels, okay? And I adjust the width, you can see that the border is added inside. All right, let me undo the process. Okay, cool. Let's suppose you want to create, and the
ये important है ना?
last thing we need to do is
38 borders. इसको अपन यूज़ करेंगे. यूज़ कैसे करेंगे इसको? Create one.
change the overflow. So I'm going to go to the overflow, and then I'm going to change it from visible to hidden. And there we go. Here is our perfect circle. But why does it function specific height for that, which is equal to width? I'm going to write 350 pixels. Great. And the last thing we need to do is change the overflow. So I'm going to go to the overflow, and then I'm going to change it from visible to hidden. And there we go. Here is our perfect circle. But why does it function like that? Do you remember when we talked about overflow, when we created a card, and inside that card there was a paragraph that was overlapping the card? Do you remember that? This is exactly the same scenario. When it's set to visible, our circle has been created since we set the radius to 50%. But we can't see that because this image inside this div block is overlapping our shape. Therefore, we need to set the overflow to hidden to create this kind of mask. The last thing I'm going to mention is that when you work with borders, you have control over properties of each edge specifically. So if you want to select the left edge and change the color, you can do that. You can set another color for the top edge. That's totally up to you. You're not limited in any way. All right, guys, that's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you in the next one. In this video, we're going to talk about the effects section. If I just scroll down here in the style panel, you can see that at the bottom we have the effects section. There are so many different options here, and we are going to talk about each of them. So first, I'm going to go ahead and select one of these images, okay? Let me select this div block, the image div block, the first one, and now I can actually modify different options here. Let me start with opacity. The opacity is so simple because it just lets us have transparency. If I decrease it, my element will be transparent. If I increase it, you can see that there is no transparency. So many different options here, and we are going to talk about each of them. So first, I'm going to go ahead and select one of these images, okay? Let me select this div block, the image div block, the first one, and now I can actually modify different options here. Let me start with opacity. The opacity is so simple because it just lets us have transparency. If I decrease it, my element will be transparent. If I increase it, you can see that there is no transparency. So when you have an element and your element has some children, you can simply select your parent element. In this case, it's this image div block, and just adjust the opacity here. Then we have box shadows. Well, as you can guess from its name, it lets us add some shadows to our box elements, okay? So if I hit this plus button, I can add some box shadows to this particular element. And here we have different properties. We have two different types of shadow, outside and inside. Well, if I increase it, you can see the first one. If different options here, and we are going to talk about each of them. So first, I'm going to go ahead and select one of these images, okay? Let me select this div block, the image div block, the first one, and now I can actually modify different options here. Let me start with opacity. The opacity is so simple because it just lets us have transparency. If I decrease it, my element will be transparent. If I increase it, you can see that there is no transparency. So when you have an element and your element has some children, you can simply select your parent element, in this case it's this image div block, and just adjust the opacity here. Then we have box shadows. Well, as you can guess from its name, it lets us add some shadows to our box elements, okay? So if I hit this plus button, I can add some box shadows to this particular element, and here we have different properties. We have two different types of shadow, outside and inside. Well, if it's set to outside, the shadow will appear outside the boundary of this element. If I just modify the distance, you can see it better. But the inside type lets us add inner shadows. I can modify the angle here, just like that. I can control the degree, or let's say the direction, and just adjust the opacity here. Then we have box shadows. Well, as you can guess from its name, it lets us add some shadows to our box elements, okay? So if I hit this plus button, I can add some box shadows to this particular element, and here we have different properties. We have two different types of shadow, outside and inside. Well, select this div block, the image div block, the first one, and now I can actually modify different options here. Let me start with opacity. The opacity is so simple because it just lets us have image div block and just some children. You can simply select no transparency. So when you have an element and your element has some children, you can simply select your parent element, in this case it's this image div block, and just adjust the opacity here. Then we have box shadows. Well, as you can guess from its name, it lets us add some shadows to our box elements, okay? So if I hit this plus button, I can add some box shadows to this particular element, and here we have different properties. We have two different types of shadow, outside and inside. Well, if it's set to outside, the shadow will appear outside the boundary of this. You can see it better. But the inside type lets us add inner shadows. I can modify the angle here, just like that. I can control the degree, or let's say the direction of my shadow. I can modify the distance. I can modify the blur, how focused this shadow is. It spreads like this. Control the color of whatever color I want. Most of the time when we use shadows, we want to make sure to decrease the opacity to have some soft shadows, okay? When we use shadows, we want to make sure to decrease the opacity to have some soft shadows, okay? Just like that. So this is all about shadows. One thing you should remember is that you can actually add multiple shadows to your element. If I click on this plus button once again, there we go. I could add another shadow. I can add even more shadows, okay? I can move them around, and I can hide and unhide them, and I can remove them simply. All right, now let's talk about 2D and 3D transforms. Well, sometimes we might need to have some simple interactions, some 2D and 3D transformations, and in that case, we need to use this option, okay? We can also use the interactions, which is more advanced, and we will talk about it later in detail. But for now, let me show you how it works. While my element is selected, I can hit this plus button, and we have different types of transformation. We have move, scale, rotate, and skew. Let me start with move. Well, the move type lets us move our elements, and we can control the X, Y, and Z axis, just like that. If I change the type to scale, I can scale this element like this. If I change it to rotate, I can rotate it like that, using different axes. There we go. And if I set it to skew, let's see what happens. Depending on our needs, we may or may not use every single one of these types, but it's good to know that they exist and the possibilities are limitless here. Now I'm going to show you something else. Let me remove these 2D and 3D transforms. I'm going to just create a new transform layer, and I'm going to move it around, okay? But what if I want to move my element and scale it at the same time? If I go to scale now and I come back, you can see that everything is lost here. All the modifications that I did here are gone. That's because we can't use all the types at the same time. We need to actually move our element, and then we need to create another layer, just like that. Now I can scale it as well. So you need to keep this in mind when working with 2D and 3D transforms. Then we have transitions. If I click on this plus button, you can see that we have different types of transitions, and we are not going to talk about transitions now because first you need to learn about states, which is the topic of our next lesson. And in the next lesson, we will touch upon transitions as well. All right, let me remove transitions. Now I'm going to talk about filters. So while this element is selected, I'm going to add a filter to this element. And here we have different filters. We have blur. We can make this element blurry, just like that. We have color adjustment filters like brightness. You can control the brightness of your element. You can modify the contrast, the hue. We have saturation, for example. You can decrease or increase the saturation of your element. We have grayscale. If you want black and white images or black and white elements, we can use this filter, and other effects. All right, now let's move on to the last property of the effects section, which is cursor. Well, every element by default has a specific cursor. For example, when I add a button, let me show you. When I go ahead and add a button here and I preview that, if I hover over, you can see that the cursor changed to this pointer, and it's expected because this is clickable. And the same thing happens if I add a link block. So if I just go ahead and add a link block here, of course I need to add something inside, or let me just change its color, background color, to something that you could see. And also I need to specify the width and height because otherwise it's invisible. So let me specify the width 50 pixels and the height 100 pixels. And now let's check it out. Again, we've got a pointer. For example, the text has its own cursor. These cursors are the default cursors of our browser, okay? But sometimes for some specific purposes, you might need to override these properties, okay? So for example, if I want to change the cursor of this button, I can select that. And here, if I open up this drop menu, by default, it's set to auto. And most of the time, it's better to use the auto option because this way the browser determines which cursor it should use. However, if you want to intentionally override these preferences, we can do that. So for example, let me change it to something else. I'm going to choose this grab and let's see if it works. Yes, it does. So this is how the cursor works. Most of the time, we don't need to change it unless we have to change it for specific reasons. All right, guys, that's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you in the next video. Hey, in this video, we're going to talk about states and transitions. Well, let's start with states. Every element we work with has some default states, like none, hover, pressed, focused, etc. On the type of element, our states might change as well. So let me show you an example. If I select this button element, and I head over to the selector section, you can see that there is this down arrow icon. If I click on that, we will get access. Hey, in this video, we're We're going to talk about states and transitions. Well, let's start with states. Every element we work with has some default states, like none, hover, pressed, focused, etc. On the type of element, our states might change as well. So let me show you an
Load up on gun, bring a friend. माँ चुद गई है भाई, माँ चुद गई है। अबे 20%
our
हुआ है
states.
बस।
We have none, hover, pressed, focused, visited. So if I select hover, I can go ahead and adjust the properties of element. Our states might change as well. So let's go. If I select this button element, and I head over to the selector section, you can see that there is this down arrow icon. If you click on that, we will get access to our states. We have none, hover, pressed, focused, visited. So if I select hover, I can go ahead and adjust the properties of the hover state. So when the user hovers over this element, the new properties will be applied to this element. So let me go ahead and modify the background's color. I'm going to change it to something lighter. All right. And now in order to see whether it works or not, first I need to go back to the none state. I'm going to go to none state. If I hover over, there we go. As you can see, as soon as I hover over this button, its color changes. When I change the properties of any of these states, this blue indicator appears, indicating that there are some properties that we modify for this particular state. But what about pressed? Well, since I changed the properties of hover, the pressed state will inherit from the properties of hover. Let me prove that to you. If I select that, there we go. We've got our light blue now. However, we can also modify that. I'm going to go ahead and change this color to something darker. And now, if I go to none, if I preview that, and now when I hover over, I will get the light blue. And if I press, you can see that we will get the dark blue. So this is basically all about states. But now I'm going to show you another example. If I scroll down here, I have a text field here. Okay, for text fields, we have an additional state. If I select it, if I go to open up my states, you can see we have this placeholder as well. And if I go to placeholder, I can customize the appearance and styling of this placeholder text. Enter your email. Okay, because right now I can't modify that in the none state. But if I go to placeholder, I can simply modify its color, for example, to red or to anything else. So let me reset that for now. And I'm going to show you another state of this text field. The text field also has the focus state, and this state is very useful for text inputs. Let me show you how it works. If I select it, and if I go to, let's say, box shadows, I'm going to add some shadows to this state. Let me change the angle and also the distance, the blur. I'm going to increase the blur, and I'm going to also increase the size, and finally decrease the opacity. All right, now let's see what happens. I'm going to preview it, nothing happens, but as soon as I click here, you can see that the focus state appears. We can use states for almost anything, even for images, for div blocks, as it happens, but as soon as I click here, it works. If I select it, and if I go to, let's say, box shadows, I'm going to add some shadows to this state, the angle, and also the distance, the blur. I'm going to increase the blur, and I'm going to also increase the size, and finally decrease the opacity. All right, now let's see what happens. I'm going to preview it, nothing happens, but as soon as I click here, you can see that the focus state appears. We can use states for almost anything, even for images, for div blocks. As you can see here, we have different states. They are so useful for these subtle interactions. But if I hover over this button, you can see that we don't have a smooth transition here. So how can we fix that? Well, we need to use the transition section here, the one that we didn't talk about in the previous lesson. But now I'm going to show you how it works. When we modify the properties of different states, or we add some effects to our elements, we can animate those changes using transitions. So right now we have 3 different states for these pairs. We can use states for almost anything, even for images, for div blocks. As you can see here, we have different states. They are so useful for these subtle interactions. But if I hover over this button, you can see that we don't have a smooth transition here. So how can we fix that? Well, we need to use the transition section here, the one that we didn't talk about in the previous lesson. But now I'm going to show you how it works. When we modify the properties of different states, or we add some effects to our elements, we can animate those changes using transitions. So right now we have 3 different states for this button: none, hover, and pressed. And whenever we want to add the transition, we need to go to the none state. It's very important, otherwise it's not going to work. So while we are in the none state, as you can see, nothing appears here, indicating that we are in the none state. I'm going to add a transition, and here I need to specify the type of transition. So I change the background color. I'm going to go ahead and look for background color. You can see we can animate all the properties, even margin and padding, flex, typography, borders, anything. I'm going to select background color, and then we have the duration. By default, it's set to 280 seconds, and the easing method, just like that. We will talk about the easing editor and easing methods later because it's kind of advanced for now. Later on, we will dive into it. For now, we're not going to touch upon that. Let's see how it works. I'm going to preview it, and there we go. Now we have this smooth transition, and the transition applies to all states. So if I press, we have a smooth transition as well. So let's go ahead ahead and do the same thing for our text input. I'm going to select this text field, and I'm going to make sure that I'm in the none state. And then let's go ahead and add the transitions. From here, I'm going to change the type from opacity to box shadow. There we go. And I'm going to change the duration this time to get a more dramatic. Select this text field, and I'm going to make sure that I'm in the none state. And then let's go ahead and add the transitions. From here, I'm going to change the type from opacity to box shadow. There we go. And I'm going to change the duration this time to get a more dramatic transition. Let's say I'm going to increase it to 500 milliseconds or half a second. Let's preview that. If I click here, there we go. Now it's focused.
Focus ही नहीं हो पा रहा यार.
And press. And whenever we want to add the transition, we need to go to the none state. It's very important, otherwise it's not going to work. So while we are in the none state, as you can see, nothing appears here, indicating that we are in the none state. I'm going to add a transition, and here I need to specify the type of transition. So I change the background color. I'm going to go ahead and look for background color. As you can see, we can animate all the properties, even margin and padding, flex, typography, borders, anything. I'm going to select background color, and then we have the duration. By default, it's set to 200 milliseconds, and the easing method, just like that. We will talk about the easing editor and easing methods later because it's kind of advanced for now. Later on, we will dive into it. For now, we're not going to touch upon that. Let's see how it works. I'm going to preview it, and there we go. Now we have this smooth transition, and the transition applies to all states. So if I press, we have a smooth transition as well. So let's go ahead and do the same thing for our text input. I'm going to select this text field, and I'm going to make sure that's in the none state. And then let's go ahead and add the transitions. From here, I'm going to change the type from opacity to box shadow. There we go. And I'm going to change the duration this time to get a more dramatic transition. Let's say I'm going to increase it to 500 milliseconds or half a second. Let's preview that. If I click here, there we go. Now it's focused. And you need to understand that transitions work both ways. So if I click somewhere else in order to go to the none state, you can see that it will be animated as well. Let's see. Did you see that? So this is basically how transitions and states work. If you want to add some simple interactions to our elements, like what I just showed you, we can always use transitions, and also we can use 2D and 3D transforms. But for more advanced interactions, we are going to use the interactions panel, and we will talk about it later. But before we wrap up this video, I'm going to show you another example. I'm going to select this image div block, and let me go to another state. I'm going to go to hover, and I'm going to add a 2D and 3D transform, and let me scale it. I'm going to slightly scale it, and then I'm going to go back to none, and finally let me add a transition to it, and I'm going to animate transform. Okay, let's preview that. There we go. Did you see that? But as you can see, it doesn't work for other images. That's because for this element, I added a combo class, okay? So this transition and all these interactions only work for this particular div block. If I want to apply to all these div blocks, what I'm going to do is remove this combo class. So now if I go to hover and I add the scale transition, since we already added it, it's still there. So I'm going to go ahead and modify that. All right, let me go to none. And I'm going to add the transitions here to transform, okay? And finally, let me add my combo class again. Let's see if it works or not. I'm going to hover over this element. It works. This element, it works. And this element. So that's how states and transitions work. All right, everybody, I click on none. And finally, let me add a transition to it. And I'm going to animate transitions. And also we can use 2D and 3D transforms. But for more advanced interactions, we are going to use the interactions example. I'm going to select this image div block, and let me go to another state. I'm going to go to hover, and I'm going to add a 2D and 3D transform, and let me scale it. I'm going to slightly scale it, and then I'm going to go back to none. And finally, let me add a transition to it, and I'm going to animate transform. Okay, let's preview that. There we go. Did you see that? But as you can see, it doesn't work for other images. That's because for this element, I added a combo class, okay? So this transition and all these interactions only work for this particular div block. If I want to apply to all these div blocks, what I'm going to do is remove this combo class. So now if I go to hover and I add the scale transition, since we already added it, it's still there. So I'm going to go ahead and modify that. All right, let me go to none. And I'm going to add the transitions here to transform, okay? And finally, let me add my combo class again. Let's see if it works or not. I'm going to hover over this element. It works. This element, it works. And this element. So that's how states and transitions work. All right, everybody, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll see you in the next one. When we want to design our page responsibly, we need to use breakpoints. What's a breakpoint? Well, a breakpoint is nothing but a specific size that applies some style changes to specific screen's width. You need to remember that we define our style changes for different screen sizes only based on the width of the browser or the width of the device itself, no matter if it's an iPad, an iPhone, or any other devices. Okay, so by default, Webflow has 4 preset breakpoints. If you take a look at the top bar here, you can see that we have the desktop, which is our base point, then we have the tablet, then we have mobile landscape, and finally mobile portrait. One important principle that you should learn about breakpoints is this: changes we make to our styles will cascade down to smaller devices and cascade up to larger devices. This is the main principle of responsive web pages. So if you learn it correctly, you can create responsive websites easily. Let's start with the desktop breakpoint. If I hover over this icon, I will get the information of this particular breakpoint, and this is called our base breakpoint. The next one is tablet, and as you can see, we will get the pixel range. It says 991 pixels and down. Then we have mobile landscape. It says 767 pixels and down. And finally, we have mobile portrait. If you want to add larger breakpoints to your project, you can do that. If you click on this icon right here, you can start adding larger breakpoints. However, keep in mind that at the moment, once you add a large breakpoint to your project, you cannot remove that. Before adding larger breakpoints, let me show you how breakpoints work. I'm going to start by selecting this title, okay? So this title looks great. The font size looks fine on this screen's width. But what if I go to tablet? On tablet, it looks great as well. What about mobile landscape? Well, here it looks fine, but I can make it smaller as well. While this is selected, I'm going to head over to the typography section here on the style panel, and I can override these properties. As you can see, all these properties have this amber color, okay? And it means that the value comes from our base breakpoint. As soon as I override this, you will see that it turns blue. So let me modify the font size to 40 pixels. There we go. It turned blue. And now this specific property comes from this breakpoint. And all the changes I make in this particular breakpoint will cascade down to mobile portrait, but it doesn't affect larger breakpoints here. So let me prove that to you. If I go to mobile portrait now, you can see that the font size is set to 40 pixels and it comes from our mobile landscape, all right? However, if I go to tablet, you can see that the font size is still 60 pixels. So this is how breakpoints work. Changes cascade downwards and upwards. If you learn this simple principle, you already know how to design responsive web pages. One important thing about breakpoints is that it only works when we modify the styles, okay, on the style panel. If we try to modify, for example, the order of these elements in the navigator, it will affect all other breakpoints as well. So let me go to mobile portrait and I'm going to change the order of these elements in the navigator, okay, like this. Now if I go to mobile landscape, the order has been changed to tablet, the same, desktop breakpoint, the same. So you need to keep in mind that when we want to modify the order of our elements, we need to do that using flexbox in the style panel and all other properties here. You can use a grid as well, and you can modify the children of your grid. You can modify the order of your flexbox children as we discussed before, but you can change the order of your elements in the navigator, okay, or on the canvas here, because the changes apply to all breakpoints. So let's suppose I want to change the color of this text. I can do that as well. However, if I change it here on the base breakpoint, it will cascade down and up. Therefore, it will affect all other breakpoints as well. Let me scroll down here, and I'm going to change the color to something else. For example, something lighter, okay? Let's see what happens on other devices. There we go. The changes apply to this breakpoint, to this one, and to this one. However, if I override the color of this text here or on any other breakpoints, let me show you what happens. If I override it here, for example, to red, okay? And if I go to desktop breakpoint and I try to change this color to black, it doesn't affect the mobile portrait breakpoint anymore. Why? Because we've already overridden that property for that particular breakpoint. There we go. It didn't change. So this is generally how breakpoints work. Unless there is a specific property set to that particular breakpoint, changes always cascade down, okay? If I remove this styling here, if I hold down the Option key or Alt key on my keyboard and I click here, click on this color text, now the styling comes from the desktop breakpoint. Let me go to desktop and I'm going to show you other things as well. So let me go to tablet, and as you can see, these images look great, although we have a narrower screen size. But what if I go to mobile landscape? Well, they are too shrinked. So I'm going to change that. We can select our image wrapper, which is a flexbox, and we can modify the properties of our flexbox. So instead of setting the direction to horizontal, I'm going to change it to vertical. Okay, great. Then I'm going to align them to the center. Finally, I'm going to select the children of this wrapper image, and here the width is set to 31% because it comes from the desktop breakpoint. I'm going to change the width to 100%, and remember, any change I make to this breakpoint will cascade down to mobile portrait as well. Now I'm going to add some bottom margin to these images. I think maybe 10 pixels would be fine, and let's see what happens if I go to mobile portrait. There we go. Now they look great. But if I go to tablet, it's intact. If I go to desktop, you can see we have still the horizontal direction, and if I select one of these children, the width is set to 31%, and it didn't change. So using breakpoints, we can create any kind of responsive pages easily and conveniently. However, there are some points that I should mention. Let's suppose I want to change this image, okay, on another breakpoint. Let's see what happens. If I select this image, and if I change it to something else, for example, this one, this change applies to all breakpoints. If I go to desktop, there we go. That's how images work. You're not changing the style. It's not possible. So you need to keep that in mind. One other important point is that if you modify the text somewhere, even on mobile portrait, it will affect all other breakpoints, because again, we are not changing the style. If I just remove this design, what if you want to remove some elements? Well, let me show you how it works. If I decide to remove this paragraph here, and I select it, and I hit delete, or I can right click on that and just delete, it will be removed from the document itself. So it will affect all other breakpoints, just like that, because it's hidden. And it's hidden only on mobile portrait. I can head over to the display settings here, and I can set the display settings to none. And now it's hidden. And it's hidden only on mobile portrait. Why? Because we have modified the CSS properties here. Let me go to desktop here. You can see that it's still there. I'm going to go to tablet. The element here, it's still in your code, but it's not visible. Alright, if I want to reset any properties here, as I mentioned before, I'm going to hold down Alt key or Option key on my keyboard and I'm going to click on that. Alternatively, you can click on this blue label and you can hit reset, just like that. But what about larger breakpoints? Well, larger breakpoints are optional. That's why they don't appear at the top here by default, but sometimes it makes sense to add larger breakpoints and specify some, let's say, specific styles for those breakpoints. I'm going to show you how it works. I'm going to add this 1280 pixels breakpoint. It says create this breakpoint and up. You cannot remove the breakpoint from the project once it's created. Alright, create one, okay? I'm going to create the next breakpoint as well. I'm going to create it. And finally, the 1920 pixel breakpoint and create. Alright, cool. Now we have all the 7 available breakpoints. And just like smaller devices, changes we make to the base breakpoint will cascade up to larger devices. So if I go to this breakpoint, and if I decide to modify the maximum width of my container here, as you can see, the maximum width is set to 1100. If I decide to increase it to, let's say, 1200, like that, this change applies to all larger devices, but it doesn't cascade down. Let me show you. If I go to this 1440 pixel breakpoint, you can see the max width is set to 1200. If I go to 1920 pixel breakpoint, there we go, again 1200. For this breakpoint, I can modify that. I can override this property, for example, to 1700. It looks much better now. However, this change doesn't apply to smaller breakpoints. Alright, that was a lot to process. Let's recap. First, you need to understand the main principle of responsiveness and breakpoints, also known as media queries, in order to make responsive design. And this principle says that changes we apply to our base breakpoint will cascade down to smaller devices and will cascade up to larger devices. So this is the main thing you need to learn. Then you need to understand that breakpoints only respond to style changes. So whatever you change on the style panel on the right side will respect the breakpoints. But if you change something in the navigator, or if you change the order of your elements in the navigator or on the canvas, it will not affect different breakpoints. The other point was that if you replace your images using an image element, it will affect all breakpoints. And last but not least, when you modify your text layers, if you change your text, it will also affect all your breakpoints. Alright guys, that's all about breakpoints. Hey, welcome back to another section of this course. In this section, we're going to start building a real-world project together. I'm so excited. So first, I'm going to show you what we are going to build, and then I'm going to explain the process, and finally, we're going to set up our project in Webflow. So without further ado, let's get started. This is the project that we're going to build in this section. It's actually a website for a fictional design agency called Circle. So together, you and I are going to build this website from scratch. We are not going to talk about the user interface process because this is not the main goal of this course. The main objective of this course is to teach you how to convert a user interface design to fully functional website. Therefore, we are not going to design this project from scratch. So I prepared the design, and I'm going to show you how you can get access to this project. So first of all, let me show you how the design looks. In this project, we are going to build 3 different pages: the home page, the project page, and the contact us page. We're going to build 2 static pages and 1 dynamic page. Of course, we will talk about the difference between static pages and dynamic pages, but for now, let me show you how the home page looks. I'm going to scroll down just like that. As you can see, we have different sections. We have testimonial section, we have services, we have a call to action section, and finally a footer. I'm going to zoom.
हाँ तो बोल। अच्छा आज भी नहीं आई क्या? तो सुन रुक, मैं आता हूँ, जूस मेरे को जूस भी पीना है। हैं? नहीं नहीं, इतना कोई लोड नहीं है। मैं स्ट्रीम तो मैं खुद के लिए कर रहा हूँ, वैसे किसी और के लिए नहीं कर रहा वैसे भी। आऊँ क्या? आता रुक। हाँ आ रहा हूँ।